Johnny leaned against the edge of the loom mill's rooftop, the cool night air brushing past him. The city of Lancaster sprawled below, its quiet streets bathed in the glow of streetlights. Beside him, the orphan sat cross-legged, spinning his magnum idly in his hands. The two had been sitting in comfortable silence for a while, but Johnny finally broke it. "I've been hearing about the original storyteller," Johnny said, his tone curious but firm. "Everyone mentions him, but I can't find anything about him on the network. It's like he doesn't exist." The orphan stopped spinning his magnum, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's because he doesn't. Not anymore. But back before any of this, before you, before me, before the network itself, he was everything." Johnny raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Everything?" The orphan nodded, his gaze distant as he stared out over the city. "Yeah. And if you really want to understand him, you've got to know about the war. The original multiversal war. The one before the Imposter and the False Storyteller." Johnny crossed his arms, his attention fully on the orphan now. "All right. I'm listening." The orphan took a deep breath, his voice soft as he began. "It all started back in the original timeline. The normal Earth. You know, the one without any multiversal shenanigans. No call signs, no Vandukes, no monsters lurking in the shadows. Just normal." Johnny frowned. "Normal doesn't seem like a word that fits in our story." The orphan chuckled lightly. "Yeah, it doesn't. But back then, there wasn't a story yet. Just a kid named Bradley, a kid with a wild imagination. He wasn't special. Not in the way we think of now. No powers, no multiversal ties. Just a regular kid who loved to dream." Johnny's brow furrowed. "Bradley? You mean?" The orphan raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me tell it. You'll see where this is going. Bradley was the kind of kid who couldn't stop thinking," the orphan continued. "Books, comics, video games, they weren't just hobbies for him. They were gateways to something bigger. Every story he read, every game he played, it all sparked something inside him. Ideas, worlds, characters. His imagination was endless." Johnny tilted his head. "Sounds like he had a creative streak." The orphan smiled faintly. "More than that. He had the kind of imagination that could reshape reality if given the chance. But back then, he didn't know that. None of us did. He just thought he was a normal kid, living a normal life." He paused, his tone growing more serious. "And then, one day, he picked up a pen. Or maybe it was a keyboard, I don't know. But he started writing. Just small things at first. Stories to entertain himself. But those stories, they were the beginning of everything." Johnny leaned forward, his curiosity growing. The beginning of what? The orphan's gaze darkened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The multiverse. Johnny blinked, his mind reeling. Wait, you're telling me the multiverse started because of one kid writing stories? The orphan nodded, his expression grim. It wasn't intentional. Bradley didn't know what he was doing. But his imagination was powerful, and his stories, they weren't just fiction. They were seeds. Little fragments of reality, growing and spreading into something bigger. Johnny ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the weight of what he was hearing. So, Bradley created the multiverse. Not exactly, the orphan said. But his stories were the first threads. The foundation. And over time, those threads grew into something no one could control, not even him. The orphan sighed, leaning back against the railing. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Because where there's creation, there's destruction. And where there's imagination, there are nightmares. That's where the war began. The original storyteller didn't just create worlds, he created things that wanted to tear them apart. Johnny's voice was low, his tone serious. And that's when the war started. The orphan nodded. Yeah. But that's just the beginning. You've heard of monsters, cryptids, the imposter, all of that. It's nothing compared to what came first. Johnny stared at the orphan, his mind racing with questions, but he stayed quiet, letting the weight of the orphan's words settle in. The night around them felt heavier, the quiet of the loom mill rooftop filled with the echoes of stories yet untold. The orphan shifted his weight, leaning against the railing as he continued. His voice was softer now, tinged with a kind of melancholic awe that Johnny hadn't heard before. But here's the thing, the orphan said, spinning his magnum idly, his gaze distant. In those early days, before the multiverse really became what it is now, we were all isolated. Locked into our own timelines. None of us could breach time, not yet. Johnny frowned, his call sign pulsing faintly. So, the Vandukes were stuck. Exactly, the orphan said with a nod. We were just Bradley's regular people, or at least as regular as you can be when your timeline decides to throw you a curveball. Each of us had our own skill sets, our own powers, but none of that was intentional. It wasn't some grand design. It just happened. Johnny raised an eyebrow. Happened how? The orphan shrugged, his voice tinged with bitterness. Think about it. A timeline gets weird, a cryptid shows up, an urban legend turns out to be true, or some cosmic horror decides to make a pit stop. Those timelines needed someone to stand up, to deal with the mess. And in each of those timelines, it was a Bradley who stepped up. Johnny leaned forward, intrigued. So, you're saying the first Vandukes were just people like me? Like you? Pretty much, the orphan replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. No grand origin story, no cosmic calling. Just regular kids, teenagers, adults, whatever, who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. And because their timelines needed them, they developed powers. Abilities that matched the challenges they faced. Johnny tilted his head. But why Bradley's? Why does it always come back to him? The orphan's expression darkened. Because Bradley's powers, his imagination made him a multiversal certainty. He didn't need to write us. He didn't have to create the Vandukes. We exist because he existed. His mind planted the seeds, and those seeds grew into us. Johnny processed that, his brow furrowing. So, you're saying we're inevitabilities? The orphan nodded, his voice grim. Yeah. Every timeline that needed someone to fight back against the chaos, it got a Bradley. And in every one of those timelines, that Bradley became something more. Some of us got super strength, others got speed, intelligence, weapons that shouldn't even exist. But all of it was a response to the madness in our worlds. He paused, his gaze narrowing. But here's the kicker, Johnny. None of us knew about each other. Not at first. We were alone. Isolated. We didn't even know the multiverse existed. Johnny frowned, leaning on the railing. Then how did it all come together? How did the Vandukes become, well, the Vandukes? The orphan sighed, his tone reflective. That's where it gets complicated. See, Bradley didn't just plant the seeds for us. He planted the seeds for the chaos too. The monsters, the cryptids, the nightmares, they all trace back to him in one way or another. His imagination wasn't just creative, it was powerful. It didn't just shape timelines, it shaped reality. Johnny's eyes widened. You're saying he created the chaos we fight? The orphan hesitated, then nodded slowly. Not on purpose. He didn't mean for any of this to happen. But when you imagine so vividly, so deeply, the lines between fiction and reality blur. And once the multiverse formed, it started pulling in all the things he imagined. The good and the bad. Johnny exhaled, his breath visible in the cool night air. So, we're fighting the unintended consequences of his imagination. Exactly, the orphan said. And because his imagination made him a certainty across all timelines, so are we. We didn't choose this, Johnny. None of us did. But the multiverse doesn't care about choice. It just is. The rooftop fell into silence for a moment, the weight of the orphan's words settling over them. Johnny stared out over Lancaster, his mind racing as he tried to piece together everything he'd just learned. And the original storyteller? Johnny asked, his voice quiet. What happened to him? The orphan's tone shifted, his voice growing heavier with a mixture of admiration and sadness as he leaned further into his story. The faint glow of the call sign network reflected in his eyes, casting him in an almost otherworldly light. And then, the Orphan began, spinning his magnum slowly. He made the first Vanduke. The one we jokingly call Fallout Boy, the man from Vault 717. Johnny raised an eyebrow. Fallout Boy? As in, inspired by that Fallout? The Orphan nodded, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah. You know how that world turned out. Vault experiments, nuclear devastation, society on the edge of extinction. But Fallout Boy wasn't just another survivor in a wasteland. He was the survivor. The first Vanduke to truly emerge as something more. The Orphan leaned forward, his tone deepening as he continued. Vault 717 was one of those experiments, but it wasn't just about testing human nature or isolation like some of the others. It was worse. They messed with genetics, pushed boundaries no one should have even thought about. They engineered the residents, testing how far they could push the human body. Johnny frowned, his call sign pulsing faintly. And Fallout Boy? He was their crowning achievement, the Orphan said, his voice filled with both reverence and anger. They gave him night sight eyes that could pierce the darkest shadows and see the unseen. Enhanced speed and strength. Immune to disease and radiation. Hell, the kid could breathe in anything or nothing and still survive. But all those gifts came with a cost. Johnny's voice was quiet. What cost? The Orphan's gaze darkened. Hell. Pure, unrelenting hell. That kid, no, that man went through things you wouldn't believe. The vault wasn't just an experiment, it was a nightmare. The residents were treated like lab rats, subjected to horrors you can't even imagine. Fallout Boy was no exception. He was their success, their prize, but he still had to endure everything they threw at him. Johnny leaned on the railing, his knuckles tightening. But he survived. Not just survived, the Orphan said, his tone fierce. He lived. He escaped Vault 717, and he didn't stop there. The Lancaster of his timeline was in ruins, nuclear fallout, roving bands of raiders, mutated horrors crawling out of every shadow. Most people would have given up. But not him. Fallout Boy brought Lancaster back from the brink. He fought every nightmare that timeline threw at him, and when that wasn't enough, he pushed further. Johnny's eyes widened. What do you mean? The Orphan smirked, his tone softening with a hint of pride. He saved North America, Johnny. Not just Lancaster. He went city by city, timeline by timeline, fighting to rebuild what was left. He united the survivors, brought order to chaos, and turned a nuclear wasteland into something livable again. Johnny exhaled, his breath visible in the cool night air. And he was the first Vanduke. The Orphan nodded, his expression turning somber. Yeah. The first. And it wasn't because Bradley created him or wrote him into existence. Fallout Boy became a Vanduke because he had to. Because his world needed someone to fight for it. Someone who wouldn't give up, no matter how bad things got. He paused, his voice lowering. And let me tell you something, Johnny, that kid went through more than any of us ever will. Vault experiments, wasteland horrors, fighting to save a continent. He didn't just survive the worst timeline imaginable, he conquered it. And he set the standard for every Vanduke that came after. Johnny stared out over the city, the weight of the Orphan's words settling over him. Fallout Boy, he must have been something else. The Orphan smiled faintly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He was. And don't let the nickname fool you, he earned his place in the history of the multiverse. Without him, none of us would be here. He was the first to prove that a Vanduke could rise above the chaos. That we could win. The Orphan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze turning more serious as he leaned back against the railing. Johnny could tell they were wading into darker waters now, and his attention sharpened. And that, the Orphan began, his voice low and deliberate, brings us to your counterpart. The Hunter Vanduke. The one you're a spin-off from. You're him, Johnny. So you already know, deep down, what happened with the Mothman. Johnny furrowed his brow. The Mothman, in the Hunter's timeline? I know pieces of it. The fight, the retreat, but not the whole story. What really happened? The Orphan's expression darkened, his voice taking on an edge. In the original Hunter timeline, the one-year timeline is a divergent version of it. Wasn't just about the fight. The Mothman retreated, sure, but that wasn't the end. That's where the original storyteller, well, he fucked up. Big time. Johnny leaned closer, the tension in the air thickening. What do you mean? The Orphan's gaze turned distant, as if replaying events from a story too painful to tell. The Mothman wasn't just another cryptid, Johnny. It was different. A copy of the original storyteller's legends and stories. The old stuff, the kind of fear humans made up to explain the shadows in the night. The fear of what's out there, lurking just beyond the light. Johnny's call sign pulsed faintly, the weight of the Orphan's words settling in his chest. So it wasn't just a monster. No, the Orphan said firmly. It was fear incarnate. A creature born from humanity's deepest, darkest fears. But this Mothman wasn't just a product of the original storyteller's imagination, it was influenced by him. His stories, his legends. It was tied to him in a way no other nightmare was. Johnny frowned. And it breached time and space. The Orphan nodded, his voice grim. Exactly. The Mothman wasn't supposed to exist outside its own timeline, but it did. It broke through, crossing timelines like it was nothing, and it started a fight that changed everything. Johnny's eyes narrowed. With who? The Orphan's voice dropped to a near whisper. With the man from Vault 717. Johnny froze, his mind racing as he pieced the story together. Fallout Boy. He fought the Mothman. The orphan nodded, his expression heavy. Yeah. It wasn't just a fight, Johnny. It was a battle between two titans, two forces that shouldn't have existed in the same timeline. The Mothman wasn't just another cryptid to Fallout Boy, it was the embodiment of fear, the kind of thing that could unravel even the strongest mind. And for the Mothman, Fallout Boy was a living nightmare. A Vanduke with powers that shouldn't have been possible, a force that defied everything the Mothman stood for. Johnny leaned forward, his voice steady. What happened? The orphan hesitated, his voice growing softer. The fight spanned weeks, maybe months. Fallout Boy hunted the Mothman across his wasteland of a timeline, while the Mothman retaliated by spreading fear and chaos. It wasn't just about their powers, it was about what they represented. Fallout Boy was a symbol of resilience, a survivor of the impossible. The Mothman was fear itself, a reminder of what humanity had lost. And the original storyteller? Johnny asked. The orphan's expression darkened further. That's where he made his mistake. He thought he could control it. The Mothman was a product of his imagination, after all his stories, his fears. He believed he could rewrite it, make it stop, maybe even erase it. But he underestimated it. Johnny's brow furrowed. What do you mean? The orphan's voice was steady, filled with a quiet anger. The Mothman wasn't just a story anymore. It had become real. It had its own will, its own power. And when the original storyteller tried to intervene, it turned on him. It fed on his fear, on his doubts, and it used that power to grow stronger. But here's where it gets worse, the orphan said, his tone edged with bitterness. The Mothman didn't stop after its fight with Fallout Boy. It couldn't. That thing was more than just a nightmare, it was a force of nature, and it refused to be beaten. Johnny frowned, his call sign glowing faintly. So, what did it do? The orphan sighed, his eyes distant as he stared into the darkness. It went back, Johnny. Back to before Fallout Boy could even start fighting it. It cheated. It broke the rules of time and space, because, to the Mothman, rules didn't matter anymore. And this time, it didn't come to fight. Johnny's jaw tightened. What did it do? The orphan's gaze turned sharp, his voice lowering. It grabbed him, Johnny. It grabbed Fallout Boy. It didn't try to kill him, it didn't need to. It dragged him out of his timeline, out of everything he'd known, and hurled him into the multiverse. Johnny's eyes widened. It threw him into the multiverse. The orphan nodded, his voice grim. Yeah. And that was the moment everything changed. Because Fallout Boy, the first Vanduke, he didn't just fall into the multiverse. He became a part of it. His powers, his resilience, everything that made him who he was, it spread. Johnny. like a ripple through every timeline. Johnny leaned back, his mind racing. You're saying his powers, they became ours. Exactly, the Orphan said, his tone steady but fierce. The night sight, the enhanced strength and speed, the ability to breathe in any air or none at all. The things that made Fallout Boy the ultimate survivor, they became part of every Bradley in every timeline. We didn't ask for it, we didn't choose it, but we became Vandukes because of him. Johnny's brow furrowed. But how? How did that happen? The Orphan smirked faintly, his expression tinged with irony. Because Fallout Boy wasn't just a person anymore. When the Mothman threw him into the multiverse, it tore down the walls between timelines, at least for us. His powers, his essence, became part of the multiverse itself. And since every Vanduke is a constant across the multiverse, his powers became ours. Johnny ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the enormity of what the Orphan was saying. So, every Bradley, every Vanduke, we're all connected to him. Yeah, the Orphan said, his tone softening. We're all fragments of him in some way. His strength, his abilities, they're in us. But it's more than that. When he was thrown into the multiverse, it wasn't just his powers that spread. It was his awareness. His knowledge of what the multiverse is, and what it could become. Johnny's call sign pulsed as he stared out over Lancaster. And that's how we became aware. The Orphan nodded. Over time, yeah. It didn't happen all at once. Some of us figured it out sooner, some later. But eventually, every Bradley became a Vanduke. We all woke up to what we are, what we can do, and what we're meant to fight. The Orphan's voice grew heavier, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm as he continued. Johnny leaned against the railing, his hands gripping the edge as the tale unraveled. And then, the Orphan said, his voice somber, came the first multiversal war. The real one. The one where we fought every foe at once. Johnny's call sign pulsed faintly, reflecting his unease. Every foe. Like the Mothman. The Orphan nodded, his gaze distant. The Mothman. The bio-slaves. The cryptids. Every nightmare from every timeline came crashing down at once. In the original timeline, we fought to hold the multiverse together. We fought to keep it alive. Johnny frowned. And what about the original storyteller? Where was he during all of this? The Orphan's expression darkened further. He was there. At first, anyway. He fought alongside us. His power wasn't just imagination, it was creation. He could write new realities into existence, erase things with a thought. He was the glue that held it all together. But it wasn't enough. Johnny raised an eyebrow, his curiosity deepening. What do you mean? The Orphan sighed, his tone filled with a quiet sorrow. The multiverse couldn't survive with him in it. His presence, his power, it was too much. It destabilized everything. And he knew it. That's why he made the ultimate sacrifice. For the good of the multiverse, he took his powers and wrote himself out of existence. Johnny's eyes widened, his voice hushed. He wrote himself out? Yeah, the orphan said, his tone bitter but reverent. He erased himself from the multiverse. From his timeline, from our memories. Everything. He became a ghost, an echo of what was. And when he was gone, the multiverse finally began to heal. Johnny frowned. Heal how? The orphan's gaze turned sharp, his voice lowering. In the worst way possible. A new original timeline formed, one without the original storyteller. It was similar to the first, but different in subtle ways. And at its center was a Bradley, the same Bradley, but one who didn't know he had powers. One who didn't know what he was. Johnny's call sign pulsed, the threads of the story tangling in his mind. And the monsters. The orphan's voice grew cold. They came back, Johnny. They always come back. But this time, they weren't just monsters. They were different, stronger, smarter, more dangerous. They found him. That Bradley. And they killed him. Johnny's breath hitched. Killed him. But if he was... The orphan cut him off, his voice sharp and final. It wasn't the end, Johnny. The orphan's voice trembled slightly, a rare crack in his usual composure, as he leaned heavily against the railing. The weight of his words seemed to press down on him, filling the cool night air with a suffocating tension. Johnny stood frozen, his call sign glowing faintly as the orphan continued. And after they killed him, the orphan said, his voice barely above a whisper, they did it. Johnny frowned, leaning closer. Did what? They crammed him into a mortal shell, the orphan said, his eyes distant. The thing that the call sign network is housed in now. That's what they turned him into, Johnny. That's where it all began. Johnny's breath caught in his throat. The call sign network. You're saying it's... The orphan nodded, his tone heavy with regret. Yeah. The original storyteller. Or what's left of him. After the monsters killed him, they didn't just end his life, they trapped him. Locked him into a construct of their own making, a mortal shell that shouldn't have existed. It was meant to be his prison. Johnny's call sign pulsed erratically, his mind reeling. But we found it. The network. We built it. We didn't know what it was, the orphan said, his voice bitter. When we found that shell, it was just there. It looked like tech, like something left behind from an advanced timeline. We thought it was a tool, a way to connect across the multiverse, to fight back against the chaos. So we made the network. We built it out of that mortal shell. Johnny's stomach churned, his fists clenching at his sides. And when we did, the orphan closed his eyes, his voice shaking. We set it free, Johnny. We set him free. The imposter. Johnny staggered back, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. The imposter came from the network. The orphan nodded slowly, his expression grim. Yeah. The network isn't just a tool, Johnny. It's a prison. And when we built it, when we activated it, we didn't realize what we were doing. We thought we were creating something to help us. Something to protect us. But all we did was unleash the imposter. Johnny's voice was barely audible. So the network, it's alive. Not just alive, the orphan said. It's a battleground. The original storyteller's essence is still in there, fighting to keep the multiverse stable. But the imposter, he's in there too. And he's been using it, manipulating it, trying to tear the multiverse apart from the inside. Johnny's call sign flared brightly, the threads of the story tangling in his mind. And we're just, what? Pawns in this. The orphan shook his head, his voice firm despite the weight of his words. No, Johnny. We're not pawns. We're the only thing standing between the imposter and the end of everything. We didn't mean to unleash him, but now it's our responsibility to stop him. The orphan's expression darkened further, the faint light of the call sign network reflecting in his eyes as he stepped away from the railing. His voice grew cold, heavy with the weight of the story he was about to tell. And then, Johnny, the orphan began, you know what the original storyteller, or rather, the imposter, did next. After we set him free, after he gained access to the network, he went back. Johnny frowned, his call sign pulsing faintly as the implications of the orphan's words sank in. Back. Back to where? The orphan's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze distant. Back to the moment he was killed by the monster. Back to save himself. Johnny staggered slightly, his mind reeling. He went back and saved himself. Yeah, the orphan said, his voice sharp. But he didn't just save himself, Johnny. He turned that version of himself, the Bradley he pulled from the jaws of death, into something worse. He twisted him, corrupted him, and gave him a new purpose. That Bradley didn't become a Vanduke. He became the false storyteller. Johnny's fists clenched at his sides. The false storyteller, he's another Bradley. The orphan nodded, his expression grim. A Bradley who was supposed to die. A Bradley who never should have existed in the multiverse as he does now. But the imposter didn't care about what was supposed to happen. He didn't care about balance or stability. He cared about power. And by saving that Bradley, by turning him into the false storyteller, he got exactly what he wanted. Johnny's voice was quiet, but laced with anger. And that's how the second multiversal war started. Yeah, the orphan said, his tone bitter. The imposter and the false storyteller teamed up, and together, they tore the multiverse apart. Every timeline, every thread they twisted them, turned them against us. The monsters got stronger. The cryptids grew smarter. Even the nightmares started working together. They wanted chaos, Johnny. Total, absolute chaos. Johnny's call sign flared brighter as he stared at the Orphan. And the Vandukes? What did we do? The Orphan smirked faintly, his usual confidence returning. What we always do. We fought back. Harder, smarter, more united than ever. The Second War was brutal, worse than the first. But it was also the moment we realized just how strong we could be. Johnny's brow furrowed, his voice steady. And the false storyteller. The Orphan's grin faded, replaced by a look of quiet rage. He became the imposter's right hand. His enforcer, his weapon, his voice. And he didn't just attack timelines, Johnny. He attacked us. He hunted Vandukes, tearing through timelines and destroying every one of us he could find. He wanted to erase us completely. Johnny's fists tightened, his voice filled with determination. But he didn't. The Orphan's eyes met Johnny's, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. No, he didn't. Because we're still here, Johnny. You, me, the network, we're still standing. And as long as we are, the imposter and the false storyteller don't get to win. The Orphan's story hung heavy in the air, the tension between him and Johnny unspoken but palpable. Before either could speak again, a strange, unnatural hum echoed through the loom mill. Both their call signs pulsed erratically, flickering with a faint, unstable light. Johnny frowned, his hand instinctively moving to his magnum. What's going on? The Orphan glanced at his call sign, his expression hardening. I don't know. This isn't normal. Elsewhere, outside the multiverse, far beyond the reach of the call sign network, in a void where time and space held no meaning, the imposter and the false storyteller watched. Their forms were fractured, flickering between shapes, their voices a blend of metallic distortion and cold malice. They talk too much, the imposter said, his voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. Always digging into the past, into things they were never meant to understand. The false storyteller smirked, his features shifting as he leaned closer to the swirling energy before them. And yet, it's their weakness. Their obsession with history, with timelines, it makes them vulnerable. The imposter's form glitched violently, his laughter a harsh, grating sound. Then let's remind them of how fragile history is. The false storyteller tilted his head, a glimmer of amusement in his shifting gaze. You're thinking what I'm thinking. The imposter raised a hand, his fractured fingers moving in impossible patterns as energy coiled around him. Send them back. Let them see the past they cling to so desperately. Let them see how little control they truly have. Back in the loom mill, the call signs flared brighter, the hum growing into a deafening roar. Johnny and the orphan stumbled, their visions blurring as the network's energy twisted and warped around them. "Johnny," the orphan shouted, his voice strained. "Something's wrong." Before he could finish, a surge of light engulfed them both, pulling them out of the loom mill and into a blinding void. When the light faded, the two Vandukes hit the ground hard, the air around them cool and unfamiliar. Johnny groaned, pushing himself up as he blinked against the fading light. The orphan was already on his feet, his call sign flickering erratically as he scanned their surroundings. Johnny glanced at his own call sign, his heart sinking. It's not reading anything. No time, no location, nothing. The orphan's gaze darted around, his expression tense. "Same here. We're cut off from the network." Johnny looked up, taking in their surroundings. The buildings were small and scattered, the streets cobbled and uneven. There were no cars, no modern lights, just the faint glow of lanterns and the distant sound of horses. "This is," Johnny's voice trailed off as realization struck. "This is Lancaster." The orphan narrowed his eyes, stepping forward cautiously. "Yeah, but not our Lancaster. Look at this place, it's old. Really old." Johnny's breath caught as the truth hit him. "Wait, is this before the revolution?" The orphan turned to him, his eyes wide. "If it is, then we're in deep trouble. No network, no backup, no modern tech. Just us and whatever sent us here." They both fell silent, their call signs pulsing faintly as if struggling to re-establish themselves. The air around them felt heavier, unfamiliar, as if even time itself was holding its breath. Johnny clenched his fists, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "Whatever this is, whoever sent us here, we're going to figure it out. And we're going to survive." The orphan smirked faintly, spinning his magnum with a touch of his usual confidence. "Yeah. Survive first. Questions later." Back in the loom mill, the air was tense. Wren paced the main floor, her spear tapping lightly against the ground as she moved. Scotty stood at a console, furiously typing commands into the interface as the faint hum of the call sign network filled the space. The rest of the team, roused from sleep, gathered around in confusion. "What do you mean they're gone?" Wren snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Scotty slammed a hand on the console, his frustration evident. "I mean gone, Wren. I've been running scans since the second the system blipped. Their call signs aren't showing up anywhere, no pings, no signals, nothing." Shade, sitting nearby with his own console, frowned. "It's like they've been cut off completely. The network is still operational, but whatever hit us knocked out our connection to them." Wren stopped pacing, her grip tightening on her spear. "This doesn't make sense. The network doesn't just lose people. Something caused this. That's not all, Scotty added, turning the monitor toward her. The loom mill itself, it took damage. Ren frowned, scanning the data on the screen. Damage? From what? Scotty shrugged helplessly. I don't know. The system doesn't show anything. No external breaches, no intrusions, nothing visible. But whatever it was strong enough to destabilize the mill's defenses. Shade leaned forward, typing quickly on his own console. I'm seeing traces of multiversal energy in the damaged areas. This wasn't just some random glitch. Someone or something did this. Ren's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. Great. So, we've got 2 missing Vandukes, a damaged mill, and no clear idea what's going on. What's the plan? Scotty leaned back, rubbing his temples. First, we stabilize the network on our end. If we can get it running at full capacity, we might have a shot at tracking them down. And if we can't, one of the team members asked nervously. Ren turned sharply, her voice firm. We will. We don't stop until we bring them back. Shade adjusted his glasses, his tone calm but focused. It's going to take time. Rebuilding the mill systems and stabilizing the network isn't a quick fix. And even if we get it fully operational, there's no guarantee we'll be able to locate them. If they've been thrown outside the normal flow of time. Ren cut him off, her tone fierce. Then we find another way. We don't leave them out there. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. The faint hum of the damaged loom mill served as a constant reminder of how precarious their position was. Scotty looked up from his console, his voice quieter now. Whatever hit us, it wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone wanted them out of the way. Ren's grip on her spear tightened, her expression hardening. Then we're not just bringing them back. We're going to find out who did this and make them pay. The team nodded, their resolve solidifying. They had no idea where Johnny and the orphan were, or how long it would take to find them. But one thing was certain, they weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Johnny and the orphan crouched on the roof of a low building, the cool night air brushing past them as they took in the sight of the quiet town below. From their vantage point, the streets of pre-independence Lancaster stretched out like a puzzle, lit by the faint glow of lanterns. The occasional sound of hoofbeats echoed through the cobbled streets, and redcoats patrolled in small groups, their polished muskets glinting in the moonlight. The orphan peered through a makeshift spyglass he'd cobbled together from spare parts in his pack, his expression grim. Yup. Definitely pre-independence. Redcoats everywhere. Johnny leaned against the edge of the roof, his call sign flickering faintly but offering no useful data. He scanned the streets below, his mind racing. This isn't just pre-independence, he said. This is before us. Way before us. The orphan nodded, lowering the spyglass. No call sign network. No multiversal knowledge base. No backup. And, oh yeah, no Vandukes. Not for another couple of centuries. Johnny spotted a wooden board nailed to a post near the town square. Squinting, he made out the faint markings, 1770. He groaned, running a hand through his hair. Fantastic. We're stuck in 1770. No Vandukes for 230 years. Our only ancestors are probably a handful of Native Americans and random European explorers who haven't even started our branch of the family tree yet. The orphan smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. So, what you're saying is, no Bradley. No backup. Just us and a timeline that doesn't know what's coming. Johnny exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. WTF is the plan, Orphan? We're stranded in a timeline with no resources, no allies, and no way to get back. The orphan tilted his head thoughtfully, his grin returning as he spun his magnum idly. Well, first, we don't panic. We've been in bad spots before, right? Johnny shot him a look. Not this bad. Okay, fair, the orphan conceded. But look at it this way. We've got two things going for us. Johnny crossed his arms, his tone skeptical. Oh, really? Enlighten me. The orphan held up a finger. First, we're Vandukes. Night sight, enhanced strength, speed, endurance, you name it, we've got it. Even without the network, we're not exactly helpless. Johnny sighed, gesturing to the redcoats below. And the second thing. The orphan grinned wider, gesturing broadly to the town. We're smart. Resourceful. And this is just another timeline to figure out. Sure, it's primitive, but it's still Lancaster. We know the layout, the landmarks. That gives us an edge. Johnny rubbed his temples, his call sign pulsing faintly. That's a nice pep talk and all, but what's the actual plan? Because unless we figure out why we're here and how to get back, we're just two guys with fancy powers stuck in the past. The orphan tapped his chin, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the town. The plan? First, we blend in. We can't afford to stand out, not with all those redcoats around. Second, we start gathering intel. Someone or something sent us here, and I don't believe in coincidences. Johnny nodded slowly, his mind reluctantly settling into the orphan's pragmatic approach. Blend in, gather intel. And if we find something out of place. The orphan's grin turned sharp, his magnum glinting faintly in the moonlight. Then we reminded why the nightmares should be afraid of the dark. Johnny smirked despite himself, his call sign pulsing faintly in agreement. All right. Let's get to work. The two Vandukes disappeared into the shadows, the cobbled streets of 1770 Lancaster sprawling before them like an open challenge. Whatever had sent them here, they weren't about to go down without a fight. Johnny crouched behind a stack of barrels in a shadowed alleyway, his call sign pulsing faintly as he scanned the street. The cobbled road was bustling with activity despite the late hour. Lanterns flickered from poles and windows, casting an uneven glow on the buildings. Redcoats marched in small patrols, their polished muskets reflecting the light. But something gnawed at Johnny, an itch in the back of his mind that wouldn't go away. "There's something not right about this place," he murmured, glancing at the Orphan, who leaned casually against a wall nearby, spinning his magnum idly. The Orphan raised an eyebrow, his usual smirk replaced by a curious frown. "Yeah? What are you seeing?" Johnny gestured subtly toward the street. "It's the timeline. It feels off. By a lot. I can't put my finger on it, but things don't add up." The Orphan narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly as he scanned the bustling street. "Go on." "There are a lot of British soldiers, sure," Johnny said, keeping his voice low, "but I'm also seeing groups of people that wouldn't migrate in large numbers until much later. Germans, Irish, even some Eastern Europeans. They shouldn't be here, not yet, not in these numbers." The Orphan's frown deepened. "That's weird, but maybe not a deal breaker." "What else?" Johnny gestured to the skyline, where the faint outlines of Lancaster's buildings stretched higher than they should have. "It's the city itself. It's too developed for 1770. The tech isn't advanced, but the infrastructure, the size of the buildings, the layout of the streets, it's all way too far along. This Lancaster's almost on par with our timeline in terms of size." The Orphan squinted, his expression growing more serious. "Yeah, now that you mention it, it doesn't feel right. Lancaster wasn't supposed to be this big back then. It was just a small borough, a trading hub, sure, but nothing like this." Johnny leaned against the wall, his brow furrowed. "And that's not all. The vibe is wrong. The people, there's something about the way they move, the way they talk. It's like they're aware of something." The Orphan's gaze flicked to a passing group of townsfolk, his call sign pulsing faintly as he scanned them. "You think they're aware of us?" Johnny shook his head. "No. Not yet, anyway. But it's like they're waiting for something. Like they're not just living their lives, they're watching." The Orphan tilted his head, his grin returning faintly. "Well, that's unsettling." Johnny sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Whatever this is, it's not just 1770 Lancaster. It's something else. Either this isn't our timeline, or something, or someone has been messing with it." The Orphan's grin widened, his tone playful despite the tension. "Oh, I love a good mystery. All right, "Boss, what's the play?" Johnny's call sign pulsed again, faint but steady. "We keep moving, keep our eyes open. If this place is off, then we need to figure out why. And fast." The orphan nodded, spinning his magnum one last time before holstering it. "Got it? Let's see what secrets this timeline's hiding." As the two Vandukes slipped further into the shadows, the bustling streets of Lancaster carried on, seemingly untouched by their presence. But the air felt heavier now, charged with a sense of anticipation that neither of them could ignore. Whatever was wrong with this timeline, it was watching them and waiting. Johnny and the orphan wandered the streets of this uncanny Lancaster, their eyes scanning for anything that could shed light on the growing mystery. The cobblestones beneath their boots felt strangely worn, as if too many years of footsteps had passed over them for 1770. Eventually, they found themselves in a quiet square, where a large, faded map was pinned to a wooden board. Johnny approached it, his call sign flickering faintly as he leaned in. The map was detailed, almost unnervingly so for the era, showing not just Lancaster but the surrounding areas. His eyes darted over the names and landmarks, and his stomach dropped. "Orphan," Johnny said, his voice tight, "look at this." The orphan stepped beside him, his grin fading as his gaze traced the map. "Well, that's weird." Johnny pointed to a spot southwest of Lancaster. "Millersville shouldn't even be called Millersville yet. It's supposed to be Millerburg, and it should barely be more than a blacksmith's house." The orphan squinted at the map, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, and look at Columbia. It's labeled as Columbia, but it's supposed to be Wright's Ferry right now, just a boat launch, not an actual settlement." Johnny's finger moved further down the map. "And this? Ironville. That place shouldn't even exist yet. It's too early for ironworks to have developed a full town." The orphan's expression grew darker, his tone sharpening. "And what about Fort Susquehannock? It should still be standing, right? A key military site for the area? But it's not here." Johnny nodded, his voice grim. "Exactly. It's gone, and it shouldn't be." The orphan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the map further. "And Afreda." He tapped the spot where the town was marked. "This shouldn't be here yet either. The cloister might exist, but an actual developed town? Not for decades." Johnny exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "This isn't just one or two anomalies, Orphan. The whole layout of the region is wrong. It's like someone hit fast forward on development but forgot to update the timeline for everything else." The orphan's tone was laced with suspicion. "Or someone's been tampering with this timeline. Shifting things around, rewriting history. But why?" Johnny stepped back from the map, his call sign pulsing faintly as he tried to make sense of it. "I don't know. But whatever's happening here, it's not natural. This isn't how 1770 Lancaster or the surrounding area is supposed to look. The orphan glanced around, his eyes scanning the quiet square as a sense of unease settled over him. All right, so what's the move? Keep exploring? Or find somewhere to hunker down and figure this out? Johnny's gaze returned to the map, his jaw tightening. We keep moving. If this timeline's been tampered with, then someone or something did it. And I want to know who. The orphan grinned faintly, his usual humor creeping back into his tone. And I'm guessing we're not here for a polite conversation. Johnny smirked despite himself, his call sign pulsing faintly. Not unless they feel like explaining themselves. Johnny froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing as he stared down the cobbled street. In the distance, a British patrol marched past, their red coats vibrant in the faint lantern light. But it wasn't the soldiers that caught his attention, it was what accompanied them. Orphan, Johnny said, his voice low and tense, tell me I'm not seeing what I think I'm seeing. The orphan followed his gaze, his hand instinctively dropping to his magnum. At the edge of the patrol, restrained by thick iron chains, was a creature that shouldn't have existed in this time or any time. Its gaunt, elongated limbs and pallid skin were unmistakable, even in the dim light. Skinwalker, the orphan muttered, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and anger. But, it's in chains. Johnny's eyes narrowed further as he took in the scene. The creature moved with a strange, unnatural grace, its head swiveling sharply as if sniffing the air. Despite its restrained state, it didn't appear frightened or subdued. If anything, it seemed loyal. It's not just in chains, Johnny said quietly. It's patrolling with them. Like a goddamn pet. The orphan let out a low whistle, his grin sharp but humorless. All right, that's a new one. Since when do the British keep skinwalkers as pets? Johnny shook his head, his call sign flickering faintly as he scanned the patrol. They don't. Not in our timeline, anyway. Skinwalkers are cryptids, they're supposed to be rogue, uncontrollable, wild. But this is something else. The orphan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he observed the patrol. Looks like they've been tamed. Or conquered. Johnny's stomach churned at the implications. You're saying the British conquered the cryptids in this timeline? The orphan shrugged, his tone laced with sarcasm. Well, they've got one walking around on a leash. If that doesn't scream conquered, I don't know what does. Johnny's mind raced as he tried to piece together what they were seeing. But how? Cryptids aren't just monsters, they're forces of nature. You can't just tame them. The orphan's smirk faded, his tone growing more serious. Unless they found a way. Maybe they've got tech we don't know about. Or maybe it's something else, something tied to whatever's off about this timeline. Johnny's gaze hardened as he watched the patrol disappear around a corner. Whatever it is, it's bad news for us. If the British have skinwalkers on their side, what else do they have? And what's stopping them from using those things against anyone who gets in their way? The orphan adjusted his grip on his magnum, his grin returning faintly. Well, one thing's for sure, we're not gonna find out just standing here. Johnny nodded, his call sign pulsing faintly as he turned away from the street. We need answers, Orphan. Fast. If the British really have conquered the cryptids, then this timeline is more screwed up than we thought. And if they haven't, the orphan asked, his tone teasing despite the tension. Johnny's eyes glinted in the faint light, his voice steady. Then someone's playing a dangerous game. And it's about time we figured out who. Johnny froze mid-sentence, his voice trailing off as his eyes scanned the scene unfolding before them. The street ahead was wide, lined with tall buildings that seemed both familiar and alien. But it wasn't the architecture that caught his attention, it was the figures moving in the dim light, patrolling alongside British soldiers. Creatures that shouldn't exist, each more horrifying than the last. A gaunt, skeletal figure with hollow eyes and twisted antlers, it was a Wendigo. Nearby, the shambling forms of rotting corpses, zombies dragging their decayed limbs across the cobbled street. Something far worse scuttled in the shadows, a grotesque, sinewy creature with blade-like appendages and an unsettling, insectoid movement. Necromorphs. Alongside them, a hulking dogman sniffed the air, its fur bristling as it moved with a feral grace. Above, pale, winged vampires flitted silently from rooftop to rooftop, their crimson eyes glowing faintly. And near the edge of a fountain, ripples formed in the water, though nothing touched it. A water demon. Johnny's breath hitched as the words escaped his lips. They're all. The orphan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he finished Johnny's sentence. Slaves. Johnny's gaze darted between the creatures, his call sign flickering faintly. This isn't just taming, Orphan. This is something else. These things aren't just walking alongside the British, they're bound to them. The orphan's face twisted with disgust, his usual smirk gone. Yeah. Look at their eyes. The Wendigo, the dogman, even the damn necromorphs, they're not moving like they want to. They're being controlled. Johnny's jaw tightened as he watched a redcoat bark an order at one of the creatures. The Wendigo flinched but obeyed, its movements stiff and unnatural. They've lost their will. Someone or something has turned them into slaves. The orphan crossed his arms, his voice dripping with disdain. It's not just one or two, Johnny. Look around. Vampires, dogmen, zombies, demons, every nightmare you can think of is here. And they're all under the same leash. Johnny's fists clenched, his call sign pulsing faintly. But how? How do you enslave creatures like this? It doesn't make sense. The orphan tilted his head thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing. Not unless you're using something they can't fight. Magic. tech, maybe even some twisted multiversal trick. Whatever it is, it's big. Johnny's voice was quiet but firm. And dangerous. They watched as the patrol passed, the creatures moving in unnatural synchronization with their captors. The street grew quiet again, but the weight of what they had seen pressed down on them like a storm. Johnny turned to the orphan, his voice steady despite the unease in his eyes. This isn't just a messed up timeline, Orphan. This is something else. This is control on a scale I didn't think was possible. The orphan nodded grimly, his grip tightening on his magnum. And whoever's pulling the strings isn't just messing with the cryptids, Johnny. They're messing with the rules of the multiverse. This isn't natural. It's a violation. Johnny exhaled slowly, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the implications. If they can do this to cryptids, what's stopping them from doing it to people? To timelines? To us? The orphan smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. Nothing, Johnny. That's why we've gotta figure this out. And fast. The two Vandukes dropped silently from the rooftops, landing on the cobbled streets with the precision of predators. The sound of their boots hitting the ground echoed sharply, drawing the attention of the British soldiers and their enslaved monstrosities. The creatures growled, hissed, and snarled, their twisted forms shifting in the dim lantern light, but the Vandukes stood their ground. Their modern clothing a stark contrast to the powdered wigs and red uniforms of the soldiers made them look like beings from another world. Their eyes, glowing with an intense, otherworldly light, pierced through the darkness, radiating defiance. Weapons gleamed in their hands, Johnny's .44 Magnum and the orphan's custom revolver. Both hummed faintly with multiversal energy, a quiet promise of devastation. The British soldiers hesitated, their muskets trembling slightly as they aimed at the strange newcomers. The creatures they held in chains stirred uneasily, their enslaved movements faltering as if sensing something far more dangerous than the soldiers who controlled them. The orphan stepped forward first, spinning his magnum casually, though his voice carried a razor-sharp edge. So you lot think you can go around enslaving whatever the hell you want? The soldiers stiffened, one of them barking out an order, though his voice wavered. Johnny stepped up beside the orphan, his call sign pulsing faintly, his eyes locked on the soldiers. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of centuries of defiance. Well, we've got news for you. He raised his magnum, pointing it at the lead soldier, who flinched but didn't lower his musket. Johnny smirked, his voice steady. We're not your kind. We're Johnny Vanduke, the Dukes of Lancaster County. The orphan grinned, his glowing eyes narrowing. And even though you don't know it yet. Johnny finished the thought, his voice dropping to a growl. This land is not yours. And it never will be. The street fell into a tense silence, the lanterns flickering as if the air itself trembled at the confrontation. The British soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, their grip on their weapons faltering. Even the enslaved cryptids seemed to sense the shift in power, their chains rattling as they stirred uneasily. The orphan tilted his head, his grin widening. "So, what's it gonna be, boys? You stand down, or we show you why the nightmares should be afraid of the dark." The lead soldier hesitated, his hand tightening on his musket as he barked another order. The cryptids lunged forward on their chains, snarling and snapping, their movements mechanical and forced. The soldiers raised their weapons, their faces pale with uncertainty. Johnny exhaled, his grip tightening on his magnum. "Guess that's a no." The orphan's grin turned feral. "Good. I was hoping you'd pick a fight." Without another word, the Vandukes moved as one, their weapons flashing in the lantern light. The battle had begun, and the enslavers of nightmares were about to learn the true meaning of fear. The British soldiers barked commands, their muskets aimed and ready. The enslaved monsters surged forward, their chains rattling and breaking as they lunged with unnatural ferocity. A Wendigo let out a blood-curdling scream, its antlers scraping against the lantern poles as it charged. Zombies shambled faster than expected, their decayed limbs jerking unnervingly, while a dogman leapt from the shadows with teeth bared and claws gleaming. But the Vandukes moved like shadows, slipping through the onslaught with ease. Their movements were fluid, almost preternatural, as they anticipated every strike before it happened. The monsters' snarls echoed through the streets, but their claws and teeth met only air as the Vandukes dodged and rolled. Johnny grinned as he sidestepped a lunge from the dogman. "Is that all you've got? I've fought worse in my sleep." The orphan flipped over a zombie, planting his boot on its back and shoving it into the path of a necromorph. "You guys should have brought backup." The soldiers fired, the crack of muskets splitting the air. But the Vandukes were already in motion, twisting and diving out of the way. The musket balls zipped past them, and with precise timing, they dodged into positions that left the monsters directly in the line of fire. A zombie staggered as a musket ball tore through its torso, letting out a guttural wail. The dogman roared as a shot grazed its flank, its glowing eyes snapping to the soldiers with a newfound rage. The Wendigo screeched, its gaunt frame jerking violently as another shot struck its side. The monsters turned on their captors, their rage unbridled. The dogman lunged at the nearest soldier, sending him flying into a barrel. Zombies clawed and bit indiscriminately, while the Wendigo charged, its antlers impaling two soldiers with a sickening crunch. Johnny laughed as he dodged another swipe from the dogman. "They don't like being shot, do they?" The orphan grinned, firing a quick shot into the air to startle a necromorph. "Guess you shouldn't treat nightmares like toys, huh?" But just as the chaos seemed ready to consume the soldiers, a commanding voice cut through the din. "Stand down." The monsters froze mid-attack, their glowing eyes dimming as they turned back toward the officer at the rear of the formation. He stepped forward, his face calm but stern, his voice carrying an unnatural weight. "Obey," he commanded, his tone laced with an almost hypnotic power. Johnny and the orphan exchanged a glance as they noticed something strange. As the officer spoke, a faint glow emanated from the ornate necklace he wore, a pendant that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his voice. Johnny's eyes narrowed, his call sign pulsing faintly. "You see that?" The orphan nodded, his grin fading as he kept his eyes on the officer. "Oh, I see it. That necklace, it's not just jewelry." Johnny's grip tightened on his magnum. "It's controlling them. The monsters aren't listening to him, they're listening to it." The orphan tilted his head, his grin returning faintly. "Well, looks like we just found our target." The officer's eyes flicked toward them, his expression cold and calculating. "You think you can defy the crown? You think you can stand against me?" Johnny smirked, leveling his magnum at the glowing pendant. "We're not standing against you. We're here to break your toys." The officer's expression darkened, his hand tightening around the pendant as the monsters began to stir again. But the Vandukes were already moving, their glowing eyes locked onto the source of the control. The battle wasn't over yet, but the Vandukes had found the key and they weren't leaving without taking it. The officer's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding, carrying an unnatural weight that sent shivers through the air. "Stand down," he bellowed, his tone dripping with authority as the monsters stiffened, their glowing eyes dimming in compliance. But Johnny and the orphan didn't stop. They moved forward steadily, their glowing eyes locked on the officer like predators stalking their prey. Their footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, deliberate and unfaltering, as the officer's expression shifted from confident to confused. The officer barked again, louder this time, his hand gripping the glowing pendant at his chest. "I said, stand down." Johnny tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're gonna strain your voice if you keep shouting like that." The orphan grinned, twirling his magnum idly as he advanced. "Yeah, buddy. Hate to break it to you, but we're not like your little pets over there." The officer's confusion deepened, his brow furrowing as he glanced between the Vandukes and the monsters at his command. How are you resisting me?" Johnny chuckled, his call sign pulsing faintly as he took another step closer. "Resisting? You think you're controlling us?" The orphan's grin widened, his glowing eyes narrowing as he gestured toward the monsters. "Here's the thing, pal. That little mind trick of yours works great on cryptids, zombies, and whatever other nightmares you've got on your leash. But us." Johnny raised his magnum, pointing it at the glowing pendant. "We're Vandukes. And in case you didn't know, we don't play by your rules." The officer's hand tightened on the pendant, his voice rising in desperation. "No one resists the crown. No one resists me." Johnny and the orphan exchanged a glance, their smirks widening. Cute speech, Johnny said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But you might want to save it for someone who cares. The orphan tilted his head, his voice laced with mockery. Yeah. See, the thing about mind control. It doesn't work on people with minds like ours. Too bad for you, huh? The officer's expression twisted with frustration, his grip on the pendant trembling as the monsters stirred uneasily around him. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Obey me." Johnny took another step forward, his glowing eyes blazing like twin embers. "We obey no one." The orphan raised his magnum, his grin turning feral. "But you're about to learn how it feels to lose control." The air grew tense, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on the street like a storm. The monsters shifted uncertainly, their glowing eyes flickering as the Vandukes closed the distance. For the first time, the officer looked genuinely afraid. He had wielded the power of control with confidence, but now, facing two beings who couldn't be bent to his will, he realized he had underestimated his opponents. And the Vandukes weren't done proving him wrong. Johnny's smirk turned razor-sharp as he leveled his magnum, the glowing barrel trained on the officer's legs. The orphan moved in sync beside him, his own weapon raised, a predatory glint in his glowing eyes. "Here's a little lesson," Johnny said, his tone cold and deliberate. "Control is nothing without balance." Before the officer could react, both Vandukes fired in unison. The shots rang out like thunder, echoing down the cobbled street. The bullets found their mark with brutal precision, shattering the officer's knees. He screamed, his legs buckling beneath him as he collapsed to the ground, the glowing pendant clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The monsters stirred, their chains rattling as they sensed the shift in power. Their movements became erratic, as if torn between obedience and instinct. The officer writhed on the ground, his cries of pain mingling with his desperate shouts. "You fools," he spat, his voice trembling with both agony and fury. "You don't understand what you've done." Johnny stepped closer, his call sign pulsing faintly as he stared down at the officer. "Oh, I think we understand just fine. You thought you could control everything, people, monsters, whatever this twisted timeline threw at you. But you forgot one important thing." The orphan crouched beside the fallen officer, his magnum resting casually on his knee as he grinned. "You don't get to control us. Not now, not ever." The officer's grip on the glowing pendant tightened, his voice faltering as he muttered something under his breath. The light from the pendant pulsed erratically, as if responding to his fear. Johnny tilted his head, his voice calm but firm. "You really don't get it, do you? That little toy of yours doesn't scare us. It never did." The orphan leaned in closer, his grin fading as his tone turned sharp. "Now, tell us who gave you that thing? And why are you enslaving nightmares?" The officer's gaze darted between the Vandukes and the pendant, his breathing ragged. You can't stop it? You can't stop him. Johnny's eyes narrowed. Him who? The officer's voice trembled as he whispered, the one who holds the strings. The master of fear itself. The Vandukes exchanged a glance, their glowing eyes reflecting the faint, erratic light of the pendant. Johnny raised his magnum again, his tone steely. We're done with your riddles. Start talking, or that pendant's the next thing we break. The officer hesitated, his expression a mixture of terror and defiance. But before he could respond, the monsters around him began to stir more violently, their glowing eyes flickering as if caught between conflicting commands. The orphan's grin returned, feral and dangerous. Looks like your leash is slipping. Better make your last words count. The officer's scream was drowned out by the sound of chains snapping, the monsters turning on their former master as the Vandukes stood back, watching the chaos unfold. Control was gone, and with it, the illusion of power. Johnny glanced down at the writhing officer, his screams now muffled by the chaos of the monsters turning on their former master. The cobblestone streets were filled with the sounds of snapping chains, growling cryptids, and the officer's desperate cries for mercy. But Johnny wasn't interested in sticking around to see how it ended. We need to go, he said sharply, holstering his magnum. His glowing eyes scanned the streets for any sign of reinforcements. If there's one mind controller with this kind of power, you can bet there are more. The orphan stood, spinning his magnum idly before holstering it as well. Yeah, I'm getting the same feeling. And I'd rather not meet his buddies while we're still figuring out what the hell is going on in this timeline. Johnny nodded, his call sign pulsing faintly as he turned toward the shadows. Let's move. We'll regroup, figure out our next move, and find out where the rest of these bastards are hiding. The two Vandukes slipped into the alleys, their steps silent as they navigated the darkened streets of Lancaster. Behind them, the chaos of the battle continued, the monsters' snarls and the officers' screams fading into the distance. The air felt heavier now, charged with the lingering presence of something unseen but watching. Johnny glanced at the orphan as they moved, his voice low but steady. That pendant was the key to controlling the monsters. You think they've got more of those things? The orphan shrugged, his usual smirk returning despite the tension. If they do, it's bad news for anyone who gets in their way. Those things don't just control monsters, they amplify fear. Did you feel it? That pressure, like the air was trying to crush you. Johnny's jaw tightened, his voice grim. Yeah. I felt it. Whatever these things are, they're not just tools. They're weapons. And if there's more than one. The orphan nodded, his tone turning serious. Then this timeline's in deep trouble. And so are we. As they slipped deeper into the maze of alleys, Johnny glanced back one last time, his call sign glowing faintly in the dim light. We need to find out who's behind this, Orphan. The British, The monsters, the mind controllers, they're just pieces of a bigger puzzle. The orphan grinned faintly, his eyes glinting in the darkness. And you know what's great about puzzles? Johnny raised an eyebrow. What? The orphan's grin widened. We're really good at breaking them. Johnny smirked despite himself, the weight of their mission pressing down on him but failing to crush his resolve. Let's get to it, then. The two Vandukes disappeared into the night, their path uncertain but their purpose clear. Whoever was pulling the strings in this twisted timeline had made a critical mistake. They'd drawn the attention of the Dukes of Lancaster. And they were coming for answers. The orphan paced back and forth in the alley, his hands gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Man, we've got some serious problems here. We're stuck in a timeline where humanity and the monsters are under mind control, and we have no idea where to start. Our call signs still out of sync with the network. No reconnection, no intel, no guidance. So, yeah, this is officially a mess. Johnny leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning the darkened street beyond. He listened to the orphan but kept his focus sharp, his instincts prickling at the edges of his awareness. Something felt off. Then, faintly, he heard it, footsteps. Soft, calculated, too quiet to be the heavy tread of a British soldier. These weren't the footsteps of a patrol, they were the steps of an assassin. Without a word, Johnny tensed, his grip tightening slightly on his holstered magnum. His glowing eyes flicked toward the orphan, who was still talking but had picked up on it too. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk played at the orphan's lips as he continued his mock rant, his hand drifting casually toward his weapon. The footsteps grew closer, barely audible against the ambient noise of the city. Whoever it was, they were good, silent, deliberate, and skilled. But not good enough to fool two Vandukes. Johnny kept his posture relaxed, pretending not to notice as the orphan played along. They both knew better than to act too soon. Let the assassin think they were unaware. Let them make the first move. But the attack never came. Instead, a voice broke the tension, low and measured, cutting through the night like a blade. I know you two know I'm here. Johnny straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing. The voice was calm, steady, and carried a weight of experience. It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. The voice continued, its tone unhurried. Get onto the rooftop. We've got things to discuss. Bradley. Johnny's call sign pulsed faintly at the mention of his name, and he exchanged a quick glance with the orphan. The orphan's smirk widened, his hand dropping from his weapon as he tilted his head toward the rooftops. Well, the orphan said lightly, his voice laced with amusement. Looks like someone's been doing their homework. Johnny nodded, his expression calm but cautious. Let's see what they want. But stay sharp. The two Vandukes moved quickly, scaling the side of the building with practiced ease. Within moments, they were on the rooftop, the city stretching out beneath them like a patchwork of shadows and flickering lights. Standing in the center of the rooftop was a figure cloaked in darkness, their face obscured by a hood. They were tall and lean, their posture relaxed but ready. A glint of steel caught the faint moonlight at their hip, a blade, not a firearm. Their voice carried the same calm authority as before. "Good. You came," the figure said, stepping forward slightly. "We have much to discuss." Johnny's glowing eyes locked onto the figure, his voice steady. "You know my name. That's a good trick. Now, who are you, and what do you want?" The figure chuckled softly, their tone carrying a hint of amusement. "Who I am isn't important right now. What's important is what you're facing and how little time you have to stop it." The orphan crossed his arms, his grin sharp. "Cryptic much? Look, if you've got something to say, say it. We're not in the mood for games." The figure inclined their head slightly. "Fair enough. But before we start, you should know this: you're not alone. There are others in this timeline who want to see the mind controllers fall. I'm one of them." Johnny's brow furrowed. "And why should we trust you?" The figure's voice turned serious, their words deliberate. "Because if you don't, you won't survive what's coming next." Johnny's glowing eyes narrowed, his call sign flickering faintly as he stared at the hooded figure. The orphan's grin faded, replaced by a look of wary curiosity. "How do you know my name?" Johnny asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "We won't even be born until the year 2000. Are you a Vanduke?" The figure hesitated for a moment before pulling back his hood, revealing a face weathered by time. His hair was white, thinning at the temples, and deep lines etched his features, telling a story of countless battles and hard-earned wisdom. Despite his age, he looked to be in his late 70s. His posture was upright, and his eyes glinted with the sharpness of someone who had seen too much but survived it all. "Yes," the man said simply. "Well, I was. After 3 multiversal wars, I got tired." Johnny and the orphan exchanged a glance, their shock evident. In all their travels, they had never met a Vanduke older than 30. Their work, their battles, their very existence, it all burned too brightly, too quickly. Most Vandukes didn't live long enough to see what old age looked like. Johnny stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You're retired." The older Vanduke nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "If you can call it that. I found this timeline after the Third War, a timeline untouched by the chaos of the multiverse. Peaceful, quiet. I thought I could finally rest." The orphan tilted his head, his grin returning faintly. "Well, you look like you've been resting for a while. What are you, 75? 80? 78, the older Vanduke replied without hesitation. And I know my age is shocking. Very few Vandukes make it this far in our line of work. The multiverse has a way of burning us out before we even realize it. Johnny's voice was tinged with disbelief. You're the first Vanduke I've ever seen live this long. How did you do it? The older Vanduke chuckled softly, his tone both amused and rueful. Luck, mostly. And knowing when to step back. I fought hard in the wars, made my share of sacrifices. But when the dust finally settled after the Third War, I realized I couldn't keep going. So, I found a timeline, this timeline, and decided it was time to let someone else carry the torch. The orphan's grin faded again, his tone more serious now. If you're retired, why come out of it now? Why show up here, on this rooftop, in the middle of all this? The older Vanduke's expression hardened, his voice lowering. Because this timeline isn't peaceful anymore. Something or someone is breaking it apart, piece by piece. And I know you two are here to stop it. But you can't do it alone. Johnny's call sign pulsed faintly, the weight of the older Vanduke's words sinking in. You know what's going on here. I know enough, the older Vanduke said. The mind controllers, the enslaved cryptids, the disruptions in the timeline, they're all connected. And they're more dangerous than you realize. Johnny crossed his arms, his voice steady. Then start talking. If you've got information, we need it. And we need it now. The older Vanduke nodded, his expression resolute. All right. But understand this, stepping back into this fight isn't something I do lightly. If I'm here, it's because what's happening in this timeline has the potential to ripple through the multiverse. And if we don't stop it here and now, it could be the start of something far worse. The rooftop fell silent, the weight of the older Vanduke's presence settling over the two younger ones. For the first time, Johnny and the orphan realized that their fight wasn't just about fixing this timeline, it was about preventing a catastrophe that could echo across every timeline in existence. The older Vanduke's voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on the rooftop as he continued, his tone filled with both pride and regret. When I arrived in this timeline, he began, his weathered face lit faintly by the glow of the moon, I knew I couldn't introduce advanced technology. Not safely. History's too fragile, one wrong move, and the consequences would ripple out like a tidal wave. But I could make changes to the political and social structures. I could help humanity see the future it deserved. Johnny and the orphan exchanged glances but remained silent, listening intently. I started small, the older Vanduke continued, his gaze distant, as if reliving the memories. I pushed for things like equal voting rights, universal citizenship, and a society where everyone had a voice. I worked with both the natives and the colonists, guiding them to see that they were stronger together. For a time, it worked. Villages became towns, and towns became communities built hand in hand by both sides. The orphan tilted his head, his expression curious. So, you built a utopia. The older Vanduke sighed, shaking his head. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For about 15 years, there was peace, cooperation, progress. But peace has a way of unraveling when greed and fear take hold. Johnny leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. What happened? The older Vanduke's jaw tightened, his hands clasping behind his back as he turned to look out over the city. Corruption. The British Crown saw the success here and wanted more control, more wealth, more power. When they discovered the monsters, they saw them not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The orphan frowned, his voice laced with disgust. They turned them into weapons. Worse, the older Vanduke said, his tone dark. They turned them into slaves. And humanity, desperate to maintain its grip on a world slipping through its fingers, grabbed at straws. They didn't just enslave the monsters, they enslaved themselves. Johnny's eyes narrowed. The crystals. The pendants that control the monsters. They're man-made. The older Vanduke nodded, his expression grim. As far as I can tell, yes. I don't know exactly how they were created or by whom, but they weren't pulled from some ancient artifact or divine power. Humanity made them. Out of desperation, fear, or greed, maybe all three. The orphan leaned against the edge of the rooftop, his grin absent for once. So, what you're saying is, they brought this on themselves. Not entirely, the older Vanduke said, his voice softer. The monsters, the cryptids, the legends, they've always been here. Humanity didn't create them, but they did try to control them. And when that control became possible, it corrupted everything. Johnny crossed his arms, his call sign pulsing faintly. And now it's out of control. Exactly, the older Vanduke said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. I thought I could guide this timeline to a better future. But in doing so, I might have accelerated its downfall. The British, the monsters, the mind control crystals, it all spiraled out of my hands. The orphan straightened, his grin returning faintly. So, what you're saying is, you broke it, and now it's our job to fix it. The older Vanduke chuckled dryly. Something like that. But if we're going to fix this, we'll need to start by dismantling the British control structures. Those crystals, their source, their distribution, their influence, everything ties back to them. Johnny nodded, his voice steady. Then that's where we start. We track the crystals, find their source, and shut it down. The older Vanduke turned to face them, his gaze sharp and determined despite his age. It won't be easy. The British won't give up their power without a fight. But if anyone can do it, it's you two. You're Vandukes. And we've always thrived in the impossible. Johnny smirked faintly, his call sign glowing brighter. Then let's get to work. The three of them turned toward the night-shrouded city, ready to face the challenges ahead. Whatever had been broken, they were determined to set it right no matter the cost. The older Vanduk leaned on the edge of the rooftop, his weathered face lit faintly by the moonlight. He paused, his gaze distant, as if searching through a fog of memories that had long since faded. Johnny and the orphan watched him closely, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. "So, old man," Johnny said cautiously, "what's your story? What was your timeline?" The older Vanduk sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of the question. "It started like all yours," he began, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of sorrow. "Normal at first. A normal life. No adventures, no powers, nothing special about me. I was just a kid." He paused, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he stared out at the quiet city below. "That changed when I was 12 years old." The orphan, who had been leaning casually against the wall, suddenly stiffened. His glowing eyes locked onto the older Vanduk, his usual grin replaced by a focused, almost predatory expression. "I never knew my name was Bradley," the older Vanduk continued, his voice softer now. "I was just a kid on the streets, running with a small gang of other kids who didn't have much of anything. They gave me a name. They called me Johnny Vanduk. A gift from the streets, because I didn't have a real one." The orphan's glowing eyes widened, and he straightened abruptly. "Johnny Vanduk," he murmured, his voice barely audible as the pieces began to click into place. "One night," the older Vanduk continued, his tone growing heavier, "we wandered into an abandoned building. Just a bunch of dumb kids looking for a thrill. But we weren't alone in there. We didn't know it then, but we were walking straight into a nightmare." He exhaled sharply, his voice tightening as he spoke the name. "Springtrap." Johnny's brow furrowed, and his call sign pulsed faintly as he glanced at the orphan. The name didn't mean much to him, but the orphan's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Afton," the orphan whispered, his fists clenching. "The man behind the slaughter." The older Vanduk nodded grimly. "That night, I woke up to the multiverse. I was the only one left. The others, my gang, they didn't make it." "Springtrap." "Afton, he took them." Johnny's eyes narrowed, his voice quiet. "And then what?" The older Vanduk's voice trembled slightly as he continued. "I thought I was alone. I thought the nightmare ended there. But it didn't. He came." The orphan's expression twisted with rage, and he stepped forward, cutting the older Vanduk off mid-sentence. "The imposter," the orphan spat, his voice dripping with venom. "The bio-slaves. The timeline was destroyed, wasn't it? From point A to point B, gone. For so long, I thought I was the only Vanduk left from that timeline." The older Vanduk's eyes met the orphan's, and for a long moment, The rooftop was silent, the air charged with unspoken grief and understanding. "You," the orphan whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "You're from my timeline. You're me." The older Vanduk nodded slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "Not exactly, but close enough. When the imposter destroyed our timeline, I thought I was the only one left, too. I thought you were gone. But here you are." The orphan stared at him, his glowing eyes filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and something close to relief. "All this time, I thought I was the last." Johnny stood silently, watching the two versions of Vanduk confront the shared trauma of their shattered timeline. The older Vanduk placed a hand on the orphan's shoulder, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You're not alone," the older Vanduk said softly. "Not anymore." For the first time, the orphan didn't have a snarky reply. He simply nodded, the weight of the moment settling over them all. The rooftop was quiet for a moment as the three Vandukes, Johnny, the orphan, and the older Vanduk stood together, the weight of their shared revelations hanging in the air. But Johnny, never one to dwell too long, broke the silence with a sharp exhale. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's focus. No call signs, no network, and no backup. But we still need a target. You've been here the longest," he added, turning to the older Vanduk. "What's their main base? Where do we start?" The older Vanduk crossed his arms, his weathered face thoughtful as he stared into the distance. "Their main base is a fortress in the heart of Lancaster, heavily guarded and crawling with mind-controlled soldiers and monsters. They call it Crown Point. It used to be a small military outpost, but over the years, they expanded it. Its massive now reinforced walls, patrols everywhere, and enough firepower to hold off an army." The orphan grinned, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Sounds like our kind of party." Johnny smirked faintly, nodding in agreement. "Tear shit up, huh? I'm in. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If this place is as fortified as you say, we need more than brute force to get in. What are we dealing with inside?" The older Vanduk frowned. "Crown Point isn't just a fortress, it's their nerve center. The crystals you saw, that's where they're distributed from. They've got labs inside, where they're experimenting on monsters to find ways to make their control even stronger. It's also where their leaders, what's left of them, operate from." The orphan tilted his head. "Leaders? You mean, like, British High Command?" The older Vanduk nodded. "Not just British officers. They've recruited minds from across the Empire, scientists, tacticians, anyone who could help them perfect the crystals and maintain control. If we hit Crown Point, we're not just taking out their main base, we're cutting the head off the snake." Johnny's brow furrowed as he thought it through. "All right, so we've got a fortress crawling with enemies, experimental labs full of monsters, and their leadership holed up inside. No call signs, no multiversal gear. What do we have? He weighed the odds. Crown Point was a fortress, crawling with enemies, experimental labs filled with monsters, and some of the British Empire's sharpest minds working to enslave everything they touched. They had no call signs to guide them, no multiversal tech to tip the scales in their favor. It was just the three of them, Johnny, the Orphan, and the older Vanduke. But when Johnny looked into the glowing eyes of his companions, he felt a surge of defiance. He tightened his grip on his magnum, the faint hum of multiversal energy still coursing through it. The determination in their shared gaze was enough to shatter doubt. "We don't need anything more than ourselves," Johnny said, his voice low but resolute. "Vandukes have fought greater threats with less. Let's go." The Orphan smirked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Now you're talking." The older Vanduke gave a faint nod, his expression hardening with resolve. No hesitation. No second guessing. "We hit hard and fast, and we don't stop until this place is ashes." They moved through the city like shadows, silent and unseen, their glowing eyes the only sign of their presence in the dim night. When they reached the outskirts of Crown Point, the fortress loomed before them, a massive structure of stone and steel, its walls bristling with armed guards and watchtowers. Lantern light flickered from the ramparts, illuminating the barrels of countless muskets. Most would have hesitated, but the Vandukes didn't pause. They didn't need a detailed plan or intricate strategy. They knew exactly what to do. They went straight for the enemy. Emerging from the shadows, the three Vandukes stepped into the dim light of the fortress's perimeter. Their eyes glowed with an unearthly brilliance, cutting through the dark like twin stars. The soldiers on patrol stopped dead, their muskets faltering as they turned to face the intruders. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the ranks. "Who are they?" one soldier murmured, his voice trembling. Another barked an order, though his own fear was evident. "Raise your weapons. Don't just stand there." The Vandukes didn't flinch. Their steps were steady, purposeful, and unrelenting. As they drew closer, Johnny's voice cut through the night like a blade, steady and cold. "Your time is up." The soldiers froze, their muskets wavering as Johnny's glowing eyes locked onto them. His tone was calm but carried an edge of raw power. "We don't want to kill you," he said. "But we will if we have to." The Orphan stepped forward, spinning his magnum idly as he grinned, his voice dripping with defiance. "Your kind, a sea away, is about to learn a lesson they'll never forget." The soldiers shuffled nervously, the tension thick in the air. The older Vanduke's voice rang out next, steady and commanding. "We are the Vandukes. We've faced worse than your nightmares. And we exist to make the nightmares afraid of the dark." Johnny raised his magnum, aiming it toward the gates of the fortress as his voice grew firmer. Once this place of yours is dismantled, we will reverse what you've done. It starts here, with our home." The soldiers faltered, their grips on their muskets loosening as fear rippled through their ranks. The glow of the Vandukes' eyes, the steel in their voices, and the sheer defiance in their stance were enough to shake even the most disciplined among them. For a moment, silence hung in the air, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, one soldier, unable to bear the weight of the moment, fired his musket. The crack of the shot split the night, but the Vandukes were already moving. Johnny sidestepped the musket ball with ease, his movements fluid and precise. The orphan laughed as he darted forward, his magnum roaring to life as he disarmed a soldier with a single, calculated shot. The older Vanduke moved with surprising speed for his age, his glowing eyes locked on the ranks of enemies before them. Chaos erupted as the soldiers scrambled to respond, their training and discipline faltering under the pressure. But for the Vandukes, this was just the beginning. They fought with precision, their every move a statement of defiance. This was their moment to show the British and the monsters enslaved by them that the Vandukes didn't just fight nightmares. They were the nightmare. The courtyard erupted into chaos as the soldiers scrambled to respond to the Vandukes' relentless assault. Muskets fired sporadically, the sharp cracks echoing against the stone walls of the fortress. But the Vandukes were always a step ahead, their movements impossibly fast, weaving through the hail of musket balls with an almost supernatural grace. Johnny fired his magnum with precision, each shot finding its mark. The glowing energy coursing through the weapon left streaks of light in its wake, shattering muskets, and disarming soldiers with ruthless efficiency. His voice cut through the pandemonium, sharp and commanding. "Stand down. You're outmatched, and you know it." The orphan, grinning like a man possessed, moved like a blur, his magnum roaring as he took down soldier after soldier with calculated ease. "You guys didn't think we'd make this easy for you, did you?" he taunted, his voice carrying a sharp edge of mockery. "Come on, is this the best the crown's got?" The older Vanduke moved with the precision of a veteran, his every step measured, his strikes deliberate. Despite his age, he fought like a man half his years, his glowing eyes scanning the battlefield for opportunities. Spotting a group of soldiers trying to regroup near the main gate, he raised his weapon, a sleek, modified musket humming with multiversal energy, and fired. The shot sent the group scattering, their confidence crumbling. "Your leadership has abandoned you," the older Vanduke called out, his voice ringing with authority. "You're fighting for chains, not freedom. Lay down your weapons while you still can." The soldiers hesitated, their grips on their muskets faltering as they exchanged nervous glances. But the commanding officer, still clutching his glowing pendant, barked an order. "Hold your ground. They're just men, they bleed like the rest of us." Johnny's eyes locked onto the officer, his call sign pulsing faintly despite its disconnected state. "You're right," Johnny said, his voice low and deadly. "We are men. But we're not like you." The orphan spun his magnum, a wild grin splitting his face as he leveled it at the officer. "And you're about to find out why." The officer sneered, raising his pendant. The glow intensified, and the chained monsters nearby, the Dogmen, Wendigos, and other abominations began to stir, their movements jerky and unnatural. They let out guttural roars and shrieks, their glowing eyes locking onto the Vandukes. The orphan's grin widened, his tone laced with defiance. "Oh, now it's a party." The monsters surged forward, their chains snapping as they lunged at the Vandukes. A Wendigo's scream pierced the air as it leapt toward Johnny, its claws gleaming in the dim light. Johnny sidestepped at the last moment, his magnum firing a precise shot that clipped its shoulder, sending it crashing into a group of soldiers. The orphan ducked under the swing of a Dogman's massive claws, planting a boot squarely in its chest and shoving it back into another monster. "Really? This is what you've got? I've fought scarier things in my nightmares." The older Vanduke raised his weapon, firing a burst of multiversal energy at a necromorph, its blade-like appendages shattering under the force. "Focus," he barked, his voice sharp. "The monsters aren't the problem, the pendant is. Take it out, and they fall." Johnny's eyes snapped to the officer, who was standing near the base of a tower, his pendant glowing brighter with every second. The monsters, driven by the artifact's power, fought with mindless fury, their movements relentless. "We need to break that thing," Johnny said, his voice tight. "Orphan, cover me." The orphan grinned, reloading his magnum with practiced speed. "You got it, boss." Johnny surged forward, weaving through the chaos with singular focus. Soldiers and monsters alike lunged at him, but he dodged, ducked, and deflected with precision. The older Vanduke provided cover, his modified musket firing bursts of energy that kept the enemies at bay. The officer's eyes widened as Johnny closed the distance, his glowing magnum aimed squarely at the pendant. "You don't know what you're doing," the officer shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. Johnny's voice was calm, but his glowing eyes burned with resolve. "No, I know exactly what I'm doing." He pulled the trigger. The shot hit the pendant dead center, shattering it in an explosion of light and energy. The officer screamed as he was thrown backward, his control over the monsters severed instantly. The creatures froze mid-attack, their glowing eyes dimming as their chains fell away. For a brief moment, the courtyard fell into a stunned silence. Then, the monsters turned. Freed from their enslavement, their rage shifted to the ones who had held them captive, the soldiers. As the chaos of the courtyard raged behind them, the three Vandukes didn't waste a second. Johnny led the way, his glowing eyes scanning the area as they slipped through the fortress's main gate. The freed monsters were still wreaking havoc outside, giving the trio the perfect distraction to move deeper into the stronghold. The interior of Crown Point was dimly lit, the flickering lanterns casting long shadows on the stone walls. The air was thick with the faint hum of machinery and the metallic tang of something unnatural. Johnny's call sign flickered faintly, struggling to connect but still unresponsive. "We need to find their lab," Johnny said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Whatever data they've got on those crystals, the monsters, everything, they've been storing it here. We can't leave without it." The orphan grinned, his magnum spinning lazily in his hand. "Finally, a proper heist. Let's steal some secrets." The older Vanduk moved beside them, his glowing eyes sharp as he scanned the corridors. "Stay focused. This isn't just about information. If they've been experimenting on monsters here, there could be live specimens or worse." The trio moved through the fortress with practiced efficiency, their footsteps silent on the stone floors. They encountered the occasional soldier, but these stragglers were no match for the Vandukes, who dispatched them quickly and quietly. The deeper they went, the louder the hum of machinery grew, until they reached a heavy iron door marked with strange symbols and reinforced with thick steel beams. "This has to be it," Johnny muttered, running his hand over the strange markings. "They're trying to keep something in or out." The orphan leaned in, inspecting the lock mechanism. "Well, they didn't count on us. Give me a second." He pulled a small toolkit from his pocket, an assortment of makeshift tools and gadgets that had served him well across countless timelines. With a few deft movements, the lock clicked open. The older Vanduk raised his weapon, nodding to Johnny. "Ready?" Johnny nodded, his hand tightening on his magnum. "Let's go." The door creaked open, revealing a massive laboratory filled with towering machines, glowing screens, and rows of containment units. The air was colder here, carrying the sterile scent of chemicals and the faint, unsettling undertone of decay. The walls were lined with shelves of notes, vials of glowing liquids, and strange, pulsating crystals. Johnny's glowing eyes scanned the room, his call sign pulsing faintly as it picked up traces of energy. "This is it," he said quietly. "Everything they've been working on is here." The orphan moved to one of the screens, his fingers flying over the keys as he hacked into the system. "Give me a second. I'll pull whatever I can." The older Vanduk inspected one of the containment units, his expression darkening as he peered inside. "Johnny," he called, his voice grim. "You need to see this." Johnny approached, his stomach sinking as he looked into the glass chamber. Inside was a creature that barely resembled anything natural. Its limbs were elongated, its skin translucent and veined with glowing lines of energy. It twitched faintly, as if alive but trapped in some kind of stasis. "They've been building them," the older Vanduk said quietly. "These aren't just monsters, they're hybrids. Experiments." "Got it," the orphan called from the terminal, breaking the heavy silence. "I pulled all their files, crystal research, monster control protocols, everything. but we need to get out of here fast. I might have tripped a few alarms. As if on cue, a loud siren blared, and red lights began flashing throughout the lab. The containment units hissed as their locks disengaged, and the machines whirred to life. "Of course you did," Johnny muttered, pulling his magnum and aiming it at the nearest containment unit. "Time to move." The orphan grinned, holstering his magnum and grabbing the data drive. "Let's go tear this place apart." The three Vandukes sprinted toward the exit as the lab descended into chaos, the sounds of hissing chambers and roaring creatures echoing behind them. They'd gotten the data, but now they had to make it out alive. Johnny skidded to a stop, his eyes scanning the stack of papers he had just grabbed from a nearby desk. The sirens blared around them, the red light casting ominous shadows across the lab, but the words on the papers froze him in place. "Guys," Johnny said, his voice sharp. "I found something. Papers on the crystals, but there's more." The orphan, clutching the data drive, paused mid-step, and turned. "What kind of more, Johnny?" "We've got alarms blaring and monsters waking up, so make it snappy." Johnny's glowing eyes flickered as he flipped through the pages. The imposter. The false storyteller. They gave the British the knowledge to make these crystals. The older Vanduke, his expression hardening, stepped closer. "You're saying this whole mess started with them?" Johnny nodded, holding up the papers. "It's all here. The crystals, the monster control, the experiments, it all came from them. But that's not the worst part." He looked up, his voice steady but grim. "They set up a cloaking device for this timeline." The orphan's smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of frustration. "A cloaking device? That explains why the call signs can't connect, why we're cut off from the network." Johnny gestured to the papers, his voice quick and urgent. "It's somewhere underground, in this building. That's why we can't get in or out of the timeline. They've locked this place off from the rest of the multiverse." The older Vanduke's face darkened, his grip tightening on his weapon. "So, even if we destroy the crystals, this timeline is still trapped. We need to find that device and shut it down." Johnny nodded, stuffing the papers into his jacket. "Exactly. If we don't, nothing we do here will matter. This timeline will stay cut off, and the imposter will keep spreading his corruption." The orphan let out a low whistle, spinning his magnum idly as his grin returned, this time more feral. "All right, then. Underground it is. Any guesses where they'd hide something like that?" The older Vanduke glanced around, his glowing eyes scanning the room. "If it's as critical as it sounds, it'll be heavily secured. Somewhere deep, reinforced, and guarded." Johnny's call sign flickered faintly as he focused. "They'll have a path down their stairs, an elevator, something. We just have to find it." The orphan grinned, his glowing eyes narrowing. Then let's start breaking things until we do. As the alarms continued to blare, the trio moved swiftly through the lab, searching for any sign of an entrance to the underground facility. The monsters in the containment units began to stir more violently, their snarls and roars growing louder. Soldiers' footsteps echoed through the corridors, closing in on their position. "Faster," Johnny urged, kicking open a door that led into another room filled with towering machines and glowing consoles. "There," the older Vanduke called, pointing to a steel door reinforced with heavy locks and marked with warning symbols. "That has to be it." The orphan grinned, raising his magnum. "And here I thought we'd have to dig." "Stand back." With a deafening crack, the orphan fired, the glowing bullet blasting through the locks and sending the door swinging open. Beyond it, a dark staircase spiraled downward into the depths of the fortress. Johnny took point, his glowing eyes cutting through the darkness as they descended. The air grew colder and heavier, the faint hum of machinery becoming louder with each step. "Whatever's down here," Johnny muttered, "it's big." The orphan chuckled, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Good. Big means we're in the right place." The older Vanduke's voice was steady but cautious. "Stay sharp. If the imposter set this up, it won't be unguarded." They reached the bottom of the staircase, stepping into a massive underground chamber filled with towering machinery and glowing crystals embedded in the walls. In the center of the room was a massive device, pulsating with an eerie, multicolored light, a cloaking device designed to sever an entire timeline from the multiverse. Johnny's jaw tightened as he took in the sight. There it is. The cloaking device. The orphan raised his magnum, his grin sharp. "Well, let's wreck it and get out of here." The older Vanduke held up a hand, his voice firm. "Wait. If we destroy it, we need to make sure it doesn't destabilize the timeline further. The imposter's tech is always rigged to blow up in your face if you're not careful." Johnny nodded, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Then let's figure this out. We're not leaving until that thing's offline and this timeline is free." The air in the underground chamber seemed to grow heavier, the hum of the cloaking device pulsating like the heartbeat of something alive. As Johnny and the others stood before the massive machine, a chilling voice echoed through the chamber, cutting through the mechanical noise like a knife. Well, trying to undo my handiwork, are we?" Johnny froze, his glowing eyes snapping toward the source of the voice. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, his silhouette familiar yet profoundly wrong. The false storyteller. His face was unmistakable, a perfect reflection of Johnny's own, but twisted, older, and darker. His eyes weren't the brilliant, glowing beacons of hope that Vandukes were known for. Instead, they were like black holes, swallowing any light that dared to approach, radiating malice and despair. The orphan reacted first, raising his magnum. "You," he growled, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. You shouldn't be here. But before he could fire, the false storyteller waved his hand. A blast of dark energy surged forward, slamming into the orphan and sending him flying into a wall with bone-crushing force. The older Vanduke moved to counter, but another wave of energy threw him aside like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, groaning in pain as he struggled to move. That left Johnny alone. The false storyteller turned to Johnny, his expression a mockery of familiarity. "Tell me, Vanduke," he said, his voice low and dripping with venom. "Do you really think your meager knowledge and strength can defeat me? Do you think I haven't anticipated every move you could make?" Johnny's grip on his magnum tightened, his glowing eyes narrowing. "I don't care how many steps ahead you think you are. I've taken down worse than you." The false storyteller laughed, the sound cold and hollow, like shards of glass scraping against each other. "Oh, I'm sure you believe that. But let me remind you, boy, I am you. I know your every thought, your every weakness." Before Johnny could react, the false storyteller raised his hand. An unseen force slammed into Johnny, throwing him backward into the stone wall. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to stand. "You're just a shadow," Johnny said, his voice steady despite the pain. "A twisted version of what a Vanduke is supposed to be." The false storyteller tilted his head, a mockery of curiosity. "And you're so sure of what a Vanduke is supposed to be? Tell me, Johnny, what have you truly accomplished? Have you saved anyone? Have you stopped anything? Or are you just a child playing hero in a game far beyond your understanding?" Johnny lunged forward, his magnum roaring as he fired a shot. But the false storyteller moved with inhuman speed, the bullet veering off course as a wave of dark energy deflected it. Johnny barely had time to brace himself before another blast hit him, sending him crashing through another wall. Johnny groaned, forcing himself to his feet again, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. "You think all your power makes you untouchable," he growled. "You're wrong. Vandukes don't give up. We don't stop. And we don't lose." The false storyteller's eyes narrowed, the dark void swallowing the dim light of the chamber. "You don't lose," he repeated, his tone mocking. "Oh, you will, Johnny. You'll lose everything. Just like the others before you." Another wave of dark energy surged forward, but this time Johnny dodged, rolling to the side and firing another shot. The bullet grazed the false storyteller's shoulder, tearing his cloak. He hissed, his black hole eyes flashing with anger. "Good," Johnny said, his voice sharp. "You can bleed." The false storyteller smirked, the expression cold and calculating. "And you can fall." With that, he surged forward, his hand outstretched, the force of his power slamming into Johnny like a freight train. Johnny hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from him as the false storyteller loomed over him. Johnny's glowing eyes flickered as he stared up at his twisted counterpart, his resolve unwavering despite the pain. "You might knock me down," he said through gritted teeth. "But you'll never stop me." The false storyteller crouched down, his face inches from Johnny's. "We'll see about that," he whispered, his voice a deadly promise. But then Johnny says, "Oh, you've made a mistake." The false storyteller smirked, looming over Johnny, his dark eyes radiating an unnatural intensity. "And what, pray tell, are my mistakes, little Vanduke? Enlighten me." Johnny's grin, bloodied but defiant, spread across his face as he looked up at the twisted version of himself. "For a Vanduke, Mr. Storyteller, you've made two big mistakes." The false storyteller's smirk faltered slightly, his expression shifting to a flicker of unease. "And what are those?" Johnny's glowing eyes narrowed, the defiance in them shining like twin stars. "First, never get this close to your enemy." The false storyteller's head tilted in confusion, his dark power still coiled around him. Johnny's grin widened. "And second," Johnny continued, his voice dripping with confidence, "don't let yourself get distracted." Before the false storyteller could react, the orphan and the older Vanduke surged out of the shadows, their glowing eyes blazing with resolve. Each grabbed hold of the false storyteller, their hands crackling with the last reserves of their multiversal energy. "Surprise, asshole," the orphan growled, his voice sharp and fierce. The older Vanduke's face was set in grim determination. "You should have stayed retired, false storyteller." The false storyteller struggled against their grip, his dark power flaring as he tried to break free. "You think you can stop me?" he roared, his voice shaking the chamber. "I am the master of this timeline. I am." "Shut up," the orphan snarled, pouring every ounce of strength into holding him steady. Together, the two Vandukes hurled the false storyteller toward the massive cloaking device at the center of the room. Johnny didn't hesitate. The moment the false storyteller collided with the machine, Johnny raised his magnum, the barrel glowing with the faint hum of multiversal power. "And third," Johnny muttered under his breath as he aimed, "don't mess with Lancaster." He fired. The bullet tore through the air, striking the cloaking device dead center. The impact triggered a chain reaction, the machine erupting in a cascade of sparks and energy. The false storyteller screamed, his dark power unraveling as the unstable energy of the cloaking device surged around him. The room was filled with blinding light, the hum of the machine rising to an unbearable crescendo. Johnny dove behind a console for cover, shouting, "Hold on to something." The explosion rocked the chamber, a shockwave of light and energy tearing through the room. When the chaos finally subsided, the cloaking device lay in ruins, the surrounding area charred and silent. The false storyteller was gone, his presence erased along with the machine's power. Johnny pulled himself to his feet, coughing as he surveyed the destruction. The orphan and the older Vandukes stumbled over, their faces smudged with soot but alive. The orphan grinned, his breathing heavy. "Well, that was fun." The older Vanduke chuckled weakly, his voice tinged with relief. "I'd say that was a bit more than fun." Johnny smirked, holstering his magnum as his glowing eyes scanned the remnants of the machine. "We did it. The cloaking device is down." The orphan looked at Johnny, his grin widening. "And you got the last word in." "Classic." Johnny shrugged, his expression softening. "What can I say? It's kind of our thing." The three Vandukes shared a moment of quiet camaraderie, their shared victory a reminder of why they fought. But they knew it wasn't over yet. The false storyteller's plans had been set back, but the fight for the timeline was far from finished. They had won this battle, but the war was still ahead. Johnny brushed the dust from his jacket, his glowing eyes catching the faint light of the ruined cloaking device. He turned to the older Vanduke, a wry smirk tugging at his lips. "Well, old man," Johnny said, his voice carrying a note of humor despite the exhaustion in his tone, "looks like you're getting to see my timeline after all." The older Vanduke chuckled, his face softening as he rested his hands on his hips. "I'd say it's about time. Though, judging by the chaos you've been dealing with, I'm not sure if I should be excited or worried." The orphan stretched, his glowing eyes narrowing with a mixture of relief and lingering adrenaline. Yeah, sentimental stuff later. Right now, we've got work to do. Let's get back to the loom mill and figure out how to fix this mess." Johnny nodded, his smirk fading as his focus sharpened. "We've got the data from the lab, and the cloaking device is gone. That means the network should be able to find us again, but we can't count on it being instant. While we wait, we start working on a cure for the mind control." The older Vanduke chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's been a long time since I've been anywhere close to home. I'll try not to ruin it for you." The orphan grinned, twirling his magnum as he stepped beside Johnny. "Let's not get too sentimental. We've got work to do. We've got the data, and now we've got to make a cure for this mind control mess." Johnny nodded, his glowing eyes narrowing with determination. "Then let's get back to the loom mill and finish what we started. Orphan, get the call signs ready." The orphan raised his wrist, activating the call sign as its faint hum began to resonate. "All right, boys. Hold on to something. Time jump in 3, 2. The air around them shimmered, the remnants of the cloaking device's energy mingling with the multiversal pulse of the call signs. A surge of light enveloped them, the chamber fading away as they were pulled through the fabric of time. The transition was rough, the call signs still recovering from the damage inflicted by the cloaking device. The world around them twisted and blurred, flashes of timelines and fragments of existence passing by in a dizzying array. Then, with a final pulse of energy, they landed. The three Vandukes stumbled slightly as they found themselves back in the familiar confines of the loom mill. The hum of their call signs faded, and the air was heavy with the scent of oil and metal. The familiar sight of their makeshift base scavenged equipment, glowing monitors, and stacks of research papers was a welcome relief. The orphan stretched, grinning as he looked around. Home sweet home. And it's still standing. That's a win. Johnny glanced at the older Vanduke, who was taking in the sight of the loom mill with a faint smile. "What do you think?" Johnny asked. The older Vanduke nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Not bad. You've made this place your own. It's got potential." Johnny smirked. "It's not much, but it works. Now let's get to work. We've got the data, and we're going to make a cure for this mind control. Whatever the imposter left behind in this timeline, we're going to undo it." The orphan grinned, cracking his knuckles as he moved toward the monitors. "All right, let's crack this data wide open. Time to save the world again." The loom mill hummed to life as the three Vandukes set to work, their determination unshaken as they prepared for the next phase of their mission. The loom mill's doors creaked open, and the familiar sounds of hurried footsteps echoed through the vast space. Ren, Scotty, and the rest of the group stumbled in, their expressions a mix of relief and exasperation. They were clutching folders, USB drives, and scavenged tech, anything they could find in their desperate search for answers. As they saw Johnny, the orphan, and the older Vanduke standing amidst the chaos of the mill, Ren froze, her eyes narrowing. "What the hell happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "We've been out there gathering data, trying to figure out where you disappeared to, and now we come back to this." Scotty waved a folder in the air, his tone incredulous. "We thought you were gone for good. The call sign network's been a mess, the loom mill systems were acting up, and we couldn't track you anywhere." Johnny held up his hands, his expression calm but serious. "All right, everyone, take a breath. I know it looks bad." "Bad?" Ren interrupted, her tone rising. "Bad doesn't even begin to cover it. We were freaking out, Johnny. And now you're back with, who's this?" She pointed at the older Vanduke, who raised an eyebrow, his expression amused. "I'm the old guy who just helped your fearless leader and his team dismantle a mind control cloaking device in an alternate timeline," he said dryly. "Nice to meet you." The orphan chuckled, leaning casually against a workbench. "It's a long story, but trust me, it's a good one. We took out the False Storyteller's little pet project, trashed some British mind control tech, and now we've got the data we need to reverse this mess." Ren crossed her arms, glaring at Johnny. "You're telling me you went on a multiversal field trip without us, trashed a British fortress, and fought the False Storyteller? And you didn't think to let us know?" Johnny sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, It wasn't exactly planned. 1 minute, we were here, and the next, we were thrown into the past by the Imposter's games. It was chaos, but we made it back. Scotty frowned, his eyes narrowing. And what about the call sign network? Why couldn't we reach you? Johnny gestured to the stack of papers and the data drive on the table. Because the timeline we were in was cloaked, cut off from the multiverse. The false storyteller set it up to isolate and control it. That's why the network couldn't find us. Ren's expression softened slightly, but her voice was still firm. And now, Johnny said, his glowing eyes narrowing with determination, we've got the data to undo everything they did. We know how the crystals work, how the mind control spreads, and even how to destroy it. But we're going to need your help. Scotty glanced at the older Vanduke, then back at Johnny. So, what's the plan? Johnny smirked, his confidence returning. The plan is simple. We take what we've learned, make a cure for the mind control, and shut this whole operation down for good. Ren sighed, shaking her head but unable to hide a small smile. All right, Johnny. But next time, try not to vanish without telling us. The orphan grinned, spinning his magnum. No promises. As the group began to settle into the work ahead, the tension eased, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but with the Vandukes leading the charge, they had a fighting chance. The loom mill buzzed with activity as the group dove headfirst into the monumental task of reversing the mind control and dismantling the false storyteller's lingering influence. The air was thick with the scent of oil, heated circuits, and the faint metallic tang of soldering. Monitors flickered with streams of data, and the hum of machinery filled the space as everyone took their place in the improvised war room. Johnny stood at the center, a table covered in papers, data drives, and blueprints spread out before him. His glowing eyes scanned the documents with laser focus. All right, everyone, he began, his voice steady but commanding. This isn't going to be easy, but we've got everything we need to get started. The orphan leaned over a monitor, typing rapidly as lines of code scrolled across the screen. I'm decrypting the files we pulled from Crown Point. There's a ton of data here, schematics for the crystals, control protocols, even research on how they were made. It's all here. Ren was hunched over a separate workstation, meticulously analyzing one of the crystals they had brought back from the lab. These things are a nightmare, she muttered, adjusting her magnifying goggles. They're a blend of natural mineral and something else. Something synthetic. It's almost like they're alive. Scotty sat nearby, flipping through pages of notes with a look of grim determination. I'm cross-referencing these files with what we already know. If we can figure out a way to disrupt the crystal's energy signature, we might be able to break the mind control. The older Vanduke, his movements deliberate but practiced, worked at a bench in the corner, assembling a makeshift EMP generator. "We'll need something portable," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If we can tune this to target the crystals without harming anything else, we'll have a shot at neutralizing them on a large scale." Johnny nodded, his mind racing as he connected the pieces of their sprawling operation. "Good. We've got the data, the crystals, and the tech. Now we need to focus on creating a cure. Something that can reverse the effects of the mind control and free anyone still under its influence." Hours turned into the deep stretches of the night as the group worked tirelessly, their shared purpose driving them forward. Coffee cups and energy bar wrappers littered the tables, the only sign of their exhaustion. But no one stopped, not with the stakes this high. The orphan eventually leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head with a satisfied grin. "Got it? The crystal's energy matrix, it's vulnerable to a specific frequency. If we hit it just right, it'll destabilize the whole thing." Ren looked up from her station, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "That's it? If we can create a pulse tuned to that frequency, it could sever the connection between the crystals and the mind control effect." Scotty smirked, thumbing through his notes. "Looks like we're making progress." Johnny stepped back from the table, his gaze sweeping over the group. "We're getting close. Keep pushing. Once we've got a working prototype, we'll need to test it. And when it works..." The orphan grinned, finishing the thought. "We take it to the source." The loom mill hummed with renewed energy as the team continued their work, the weight of their mission tempered by the hope that they were finally turning the tide. The false storyteller had dealt his hand, but the Vandukes and their team weren't just fighting back. Johnny nodded as he paced the loom mill's central work area, the weight of the task pressing on his shoulders. The chatter of keyboards and the hum of machinery filled the room, but his mind was fixed on one thing: making the cure not just effective but unstoppable. "We can't just make something localized," Johnny said, stopping to look at the orphan, Ren, and the older Vanduke. "This has to cover the entire planet's surface, underground, everything. If we leave even a trace of the mind control network, it'll find a way to rebuild." Ren adjusted her goggles, glancing over the glowing crystal under her tools. "That means the pulse has to travel through solid earth, metal, and whatever else these bastards have buried. It's not just about range, it's about penetration." The orphan leaned against a nearby console, spinning his magnum idly. "Lucky for us, we've got multiversal brains in the room. We can amplify the pulse, maybe tie it into the planet's natural electromagnetic field. Make it spread like wildfire." Scotty, flipping through a thick binder of notes, looked up, frowning. "That's great and all, but won't that fry, like, every piece of tech on the planet? EMPs are notorious for collateral damage." Johnny shook his head. "Not if we tune it right. We're not targeting all electronics, just the crystals and anything infected by their energy signature." The older Vanduke, standing at a makeshift workbench with his portable EMP prototype, spoke up. To do that, we'll need precision. The pulse has to seek out the specific frequency of the crystal's energy matrix while leaving everything else untouched. Ren leaned back, her brow furrowed as she thought it through. If we amplify it enough to cover the planet, we'll need a relay system. Something to distribute the pulse evenly across the globe. The orphan's grin widened. Satellites. The British Crown had early tech in orbit. Primitive, but it could work. Johnny raised an eyebrow. You think those relics are still functional? The orphan shrugged, his glowing eyes flickering mischievously. If they're not, we'll make them functional. Rewire them, repurpose them, whatever it takes. Scotty frowned, his expression skeptical. Even if we do all that, how do we make sure we hit every underground network? You know as well as I do those bastards always leave redundancies. The older Vandukes stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We don't just rely on one pulse. We create a cascade, multiple waves that penetrate deeper with each pass. By the time the last wave hits, there won't be a single crystal left untouched. Ren's eyes lit up with realization. A pulse cascade. If we stagger the frequencies in intervals, we could essentially scrub the entire planet layer by layer. Johnny nodded, his confidence growing. Exactly. We hit them hard, and we hit them everywhere. Surface, underground, and even in the air if we have to. The orphan grinned, his excitement palpable. All right, then. Let's build this bad boy. The team got to work, the loom mill buzzing with activity. Ren focused on refining the frequency calibration, her hands steady as she tuned the equipment to target the crystal's energy signature. The orphan began compiling old orbital maps and satellite schematics, figuring out how to bring the ancient tech back online. Scotty worked tirelessly to ensure the data they'd gathered aligned with their plan, while the older Vanduke continued modifying the EMP generator, making it powerful enough to sustain the cascade. Johnny stood at the center, his glowing eyes scanning their progress. This is it, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. We're not just fighting back. We're ending this. The hours stretched on, but no one stopped. Every piece of tech, every wire, and every calculation brought them closer to their goal. When they were finished, the device would be more than a weapon, it would be humanity's salvation. And there wouldn't be a corner of the planet left untouched by its cleansing pulse. The false storyteller had made his move, but now it was their turn. The loom mill was quiet as the team stood around the completed device, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. The generator hummed faintly, its sleek design a testament to their tireless work and unwavering determination. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting the machine to the loom mill's makeshift power grid. Johnny stood at the center, his glowing eyes fixed on the device. The others surrounded him: Ren, Scotty, the orphan, and the older Vanduke, each carrying the scars of their journey but united in purpose. Johnny exhaled slowly, his voice steady but laced with finality. "It's ready." The orphan leaned against the workbench, spinning his magnum lazily. "Damn right it's ready. All we have to do is flip the switch and let it rip." Ren crossed her arms, her expression a mix of relief and tension. "You're sure it'll work? The cascade, the frequency targeting, all of it?" Johnny nodded. "We triple-checked everything. The pulse will seek out every crystal, every infected system surface, underground, everywhere. When it's done, there won't be a trace of their mind control left." The older Vanduke stepped forward, his expression serious but resolute. "It's not just about the crystals. This is about taking back our home. This timeline. This planet. We're not leaving until it's free." Scotty, standing by the main console, swallowed nervously. "What about, collateral damage? Are we sure this won't fry every piece of tech on the planet?" Johnny placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "The frequency is tuned. Only the crystals and infected systems will be hit. Everything else will be fine." Scotty nodded, though his unease lingered. "All right. Then let's end this game." The orphan grinned, stepping up to the console. "Damn right. Time to show the false storyteller what happens when you mess with Lancaster." Johnny turned to the team, his glowing eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Once we start this, there's no turning back. The pulse will ripple across the planet, and if there's anything we missed, we'll have to deal with it as it comes. But this is it, the final move." Ren nodded, her voice steady. "Do it, Johnny." The older Vanduke placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder. "Make it count." The orphan gestured dramatically toward the console. "After you, boss." Johnny stepped up to the control panel, his hand hovering over the activation switch. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do sinking in. Then he glanced back at his team, their determined faces giving him the strength to move forward. With a steady hand, Johnny flipped the switch. The generator roared to life, the hum of energy building into a deep, resonating pulse. Lights flickered across the loom mill as the cascade began, the first wave of energy surging out into the world. The air around them vibrated with raw power, the sound almost deafening. On the monitors, they watched as the pulse spread across the globe, its energy signature lighting up the map like a web of fire. Crystal networks shattered, their energy signatures disappearing one by one. Underground nodes collapsed, their influence severed. The entire planet seemed to tremble as the cascade worked its way through every corner of the timeline. The orphan let out a low whistle, his grin wide. "That's one hell of a light show." Ren's voice was tinged with awe. "It's working. It's actually working." Johnny watched the screens, his glowing eyes unwavering. "This isn't just about winning," he said quietly. "It's about taking back what's ours." The final wave rippled out, the energy dissipating as the generator powered down. Silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the monitors as they displayed the aftermath. The crystals were gone, their influence eradicated. The timeline was free. The older Vanduk let out a long breath, his expression softening. "We did it." Scotty, still staring at the screens, grinned nervously. I think we just saved the world." The orphan laughed, clapping Johnny on the back. "Damn right we did. Game over, false storyteller." Johnny stepped back from the console, his voice calm but firm. "Not just the false storyteller. The imposter, the crystals, all of it. It's over." For the first time in what felt like forever, the team allowed themselves a moment of relief. They had fought, bled, and sacrificed, but they had won. The nightmare was over. For now. The older Vanduk leaned against the workbench, his weathered face lit by the soft glow of the monitors. He looked at Johnny, the orphan, and the rest of the team, his expression thoughtful. The chaos of the battle had finally ebbed, leaving a strange sense of calm in its wake. Johnny broke the silence, his glowing eyes steady. "So, old man, want to stay with us? I think that timeline of yours deserves a break from all the multiversal chaos." The older Vanduk chuckled softly, the sound carrying a mix of weariness and gratitude. "A break, huh? Can't say I disagree with you there. My timeline's been through enough. And it's been a long time since I've been around people who actually understand what it means to be a Vanduk." The orphan grinned, leaning back against a chair with his magnum resting casually on his lap. "Yeah, stick around, old guy. We could use someone who actually knows how to handle themselves without breaking half the multiverse." Ren smirked, crossing her arms. "And maybe you can teach these two a thing or two about not jumping headfirst into trouble." Scotty added with a nervous laugh. "Plus, you've got, like, experience. You know, the kind that doesn't come with glowing eyes and overconfidence." The older Vanduk smiled faintly, looking at Johnny. "You've got a good team here. It's rare to find that kind of trust in a fight like this." Johnny nodded, his voice steady. "We couldn't have done this without you. And if you want to stick around, there's always room for another Vanduk. Especially one who's seen as much as you have." The older Vanduk hesitated for a moment, his gaze distant as if weighing the years of battles he'd fought and the weight of his own timeline. Then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "All right. I'll stay. But only if you promise to stop calling me old man." The orphan laughed, his glowing eyes gleaming. "Deal. But don't expect us to go easy on you just because you've got a few extra wrinkles." The team shared a rare moment of lightheartedness, the weight of their victory tempered by the hope of a future where they could rebuild. The older Vanduke had found a place among them, and for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. The loom mill hummed with quiet energy as the group prepared for whatever came next. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment to breathe, knowing they had fought and won against impossible odds. Together.
En ce moment de transition solennelle, j'implore le divin de nous accorder miséricorde et guidance. Que nos vies soient épargnées de nouvelles souffrances et que nos âmes trouvent du réconfort dans la promesse d'un avenir meilleur. Qu'il y ait une lueur d'optimisme au milieu de l'obscurité, une lueur d'espoir qui éclairera notre chemin à suivre. À l'aube de cette nouvelle ère, nous devons nous souvenir des leçons du passé. Honorer les sacrifices consentis et nous efforcer de construire un monde juste, prospère et en paix. Puisse cette nouvelle union, forgée dans le creuset de l'adversité, témoigner de la résilience et de l'esprit indomptable de notre peuple. Amen.
Мы проиграли давным-давно. Я боюсь, что наш маленький трюк неповиновения привел к массовой утечке наших ресурсов. Я надеюсь, что со временем эта чумная земля ждет всех нас. Упокоен я, как единственный оставшийся член правительства моей страны, находящийся в процессе восстановления, полностью подписываюсь под новым пактом. Россия присоединится в качестве третьего штата наряду с Канадой, вторым штатом и Аляской, первым штатом в качестве нового объединенного штата Америка. Да помилует Бог нашу жизнь и души, и да будет надежда на будущее. Аминь. Мы проиграли давным-давно. Я боюсь, что наш маленький трюк неповиновения привел к массовой утечке наших ресурсов. Я надеюсь, что со временем эта чумная земля ждет всех нас. Упокоен я, как единственный оставшийся член правительства моей страны, находящийся в процессе восстановления, полностью подписываюсь под новым пактом. Россия присоединится в качестве третьего штата наряду с Канадой, вторым штатом и Аляской, первым штатом в качестве нового объединенного штата Америка. Да помилует Бог нашу жизнь и души, и да будет надежда на будущее. Аминь.